Any audio is weird, any video is weird. This is our first live show of the 2022 football season. And Josh, Notre Dame and Ohio State, it's a little bit tighter than we expected. What's going on there?
It's interesting. We've talked a lot over the years about how offenses these days seem to be predicated on receiver play. I think when Jackson Smith and Jigba went down in the first half, it really kind of threw a wrench into the rhythm of Ohio State's offense. And another observation we had early last year, which I think was maybe not the most popular one, was that we thought C.J. Stroud was very much a rhythm passer. And early in the season, he wasn't in rhythm last year. We didn't think he was necessarily playing at that high of a level. And he got comfortable and played better. I think right now, between the receiver injury situation and the fact that the offense hasn't gotten going, I think Stroud is out of rhythm, and he looks a lot to me like the guy we saw early, a little bit against Oregon and some other teams. And the difference, of course, being that Ohio State doesn't have Olave and Wilson to just kind of be streaking wide open down the field, right? So everything's a lot more contested, and the little mistakes are compounding in a way that they really didn't end up compounding last year. I still think at any point they could get things going, but you start getting later and later in the game, and that hasn't happened yet.
So the other one we're watching, obviously, is Florida and Utah, and I've been pretty impressed with both of these teams. It seemed like, sometimes when there's close games, it's a lot of bad football, but it seems like both of these teams are pretty good, pretty physical, seem like kind of straightforward football that we've seen tonight. What's interesting to me, and Josh, I don't know how much you've been watching the last couple of minutes as we've gotten ready to go live, but it seems like Utah's physicality is held up, and Florida, at least on defense, has started to get gassed. And the talk was that, the humidity might pay dividends in the fourth quarter for Florida, but it looks like both of these offenses are doing a little bit better than the defenses right now.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. The reality is I think no team is really completely used to playing in heat and humidity at a high level for a long time. And what's really happening in that Utah game is Utah is running the ball a lot, and Florida is starting to get tired. Florida doesn't have great depth. I picked Florida to win that game. I think some fans thought we were crazy one way or the other. I don't think it was crazy to pick them to win, even if they don't. But you can definitely see the fact that they are in a little bit of a rebuild, even if they've managed to cobble together some good starters. And so they're just not really operating at maximum efficiency, so to speak. I think that game is gonna be one that comes down to the wire, and it's like a lot of them, right? Two teams get tired, and you get a lot of points scored at the end of the ball game.
So one of the things that we've seen is, and yeah, that fumble was wild. I can't believe he picked that up. One of the things that we've seen is Anthony Richardson made some big plays with his feet. We saw that. We expected that coming in the game. Cam Rising, though, has actually been the more effective runner in terms of keeping the chains moving. I think that Anthony Richardson has a little bit more in the yardage and the yards per carry department. But in terms of keeping the other team off the field, he had that one big run. Cam Rising's been consistently kind of hurting Florida. And it seems like Utah's approach of like, hey, let's get 4 yards of play and just keep their offense off the field has really worked.
Yeah, I think so. I think Florida really hasn't had an answer for Cam Rising's legs this whole game. I think it speaks a little bit to the athleticism in the back seven for Florida. That's something we've talked about a lot the past few years coming out of the Dan Mullen era, really dating back previously to McElwain. They didn't recruit great at linebacker and on the back end. And I don't know that they've got the sort of, athletes you're used to seeing on the edges. And they've got a good one in Bretton Cox. I think the fact that they've gotten a little healthier at linebacker is good. But they still don't have SEC high 4-star, 5-star guys, in their second or third year in the program. They just aren't those kinds of guys at Florida right now across the board. And I think that's showing a little bit because they're having a hard time with containment. They're still playing well because the guys they have are pretty experienced. But I think the lack of just really high-end talent is showing a lot. And, and then it's starting to compound everything else, right? Because those scrambles end up turning into first downs, which turn into more plays and long drives. And all of a sudden the defense starts to get pretty worn out at the front.
So real quick before we go back to Ohio State and Notre Dame, is it kind of a bad matchup, or a more favorable matchup when a team might be more talented than you at the skill player position and the DB position. Um, if you rely on running quarterbacks, good offensive line, and tight ends like Utah does, because I feel like that combination has sort of neutralized some of the advantages that Florida might have, on the edges or on the outside.
Yeah, I think so. It's been interesting, really, in two games now. We got the Ohio State game and the Florida game, where you felt like the edges might have been the advantage for one team or the other, and it hasn't really materialized. They both ended up being games that are being more dominated at the line of scrimmage, and I think the more that happens, the more some of those high level talent, speed advantages that you expect to see in a ball game start to disappear. I actually think it's really to Florida's credit that they're in this game, given the way the game has progressed. I don't think if you told most people that Florida was going to be playing a ground and pound game, given where the roster's at and given how good Utah is at that style of play, you would have assumed that Utah would be a little more in control of the game, and obviously they are.
And we got a fourth down coming up. They just took a timeout. I feel like, and the reason y'all were a little heavy on Florida Utah is it's about to end. We got another quarter and plus some change in the other game. I feel like game one, in terms of well coached, feeling like Napier sort of, put his stamp on it versus what we saw towards the end of the Mullen era has at least been an improvement. Even if Florida doesn't win this game, if I'm a Florida fan, I'm encouraged from that. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, no, I'm definitely encouraged. I mean, this is a top 10 team, and you're taking them down in the wire with a team that's not really supposed to be that competitive in the SEC this year and under a lot of people's purview. I had Florida in the top 10. I called it a vote for hope. I mean, anytime you're doing preseason projections or preseason polls, I think it's all pretty much guesswork, right? But I think this is a good sign. Now, there were reasons I put them as high as I did. I think they have the pieces to take a big step forward. They were a good team early last year, and they fell off in part due to the fact that the players kind of quit on the coaching staff. The coaching staff may well quit on the players. So I think maybe people were a little premature to bury them because that talent that let them be good early last year is still clearly there. But it's definitely looks like a more competitive Florida team than I think probably nationally a lot of fans expected. And I don't think this is a fluke or a sign, if they were to beat Utah, that Utah is overrated or something. Florida is just a team that's talented enough to play with a team of this caliber.
All right, Josh, we're going to do a top 10 later. Is Georgia going to be your number one? Because what they did to Oregon, we give a lot of credit for teams that can handle maybe good, not great teams the way that Georgia did today. That game could have been 70-0 if they wanted.
Well, that's maybe a bigger conversation. So Alabama and Georgia is going to be a tough one to pick between the two because Alabama handled Utah State in the first half, at least that I saw, as if they weren't on the field. And I felt like Georgia wasn't that different. But maybe this is a good time to have this conversation right now. We got these two other games going on. Do you want to talk a little bit about the Georgia game and what happened in that game and how we feel about Georgia and Oregon coming out of it?
Yeah, you also might want to do a little play-by-play with this Florida Utah game coming down the wire, but it's up to you, bud. Wherever you want to take it.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's just a ton of stoppage, but so as we're waiting for this Florida game to sort of get to a closing point, I will say the Georgia game obviously was a dominant performance by Georgia, really in both facets of the game. Defensively, Georgia controlled the line of scrimmage the entire time. I thought their secondary held up a lot better than I would have expected, given the amount of turnover they had in the back seven. There really weren't hardly any busts to speak of. Now, some of that is a bit of the Bo Nix factor. Bo Nix, at his best, is still not the best guy at exposing a defense with young players. What he is good at is creating. But that's not the same thing, right? Maybe a more consistent quarterback does a better job of making a team look young. What Bo Nix does is sort of pull a play out when nothing's there. But in that game, he really kind of pulled plays out the opposite direction, right? He dug a hole. I will say, and it looks like, I don't know where I'm at in feet compared to everyone else, but now Florida down to the 2 with a minute 30 left. I'll probably shut up in just a second. The thing that I want to talk about in that Georgia game really is an evaluation of where Oregon's at and how we want to try to evaluate the game in view of that. When I watched the spring game between Oregon and themselves, I talked a lot about how that ball was just flying back and forth all night. And they had a lot of interceptions. They had a lot of big touchdowns. And my takeaway was that I thought the wide receivers from Oregon were really dynamic because they were running away from the secondary. Having seen the Georgia game, and this is the problem when you evaluate spring games or scrimmages, I think you start to have to wonder if the Oregon secondary is just that bad, because I didn't think the Oregon receivers looked at all explosive or fast in that Georgia game. And, there's two ways that you can move the ball offensively, right? Like, you can move the ball offensively by making contested plays, by shaking tackles. And Georgia did that to a large extent, and they did it in huge chunks in the game. So it's not a takeaway on Georgia. And I'm not saying they couldn't do it. They were very impressive, and they did do that. But you can also move the ball to throw into wide open receivers. And that happened a lot, like a lot. So, there is a thing in a football game where if you're scoring just constantly and quickly, the defense is probably doing something wrong. Like football, even when you play a team and a G5 team or somebody that's way below your level, as long as they're within a couple tiers, you should be able to keep them sort of slowed down. And I didn't even feel like Oregon could do that with any consistency. So I absolutely think Georgia is one of the top two teams in the country. Right now, win or lose, it's going to be hard for me to keep Ohio State above them, at least. But I also want to hold a little bit back, because I do think there's a real potential of the fact that Oregon maybe, they had some transfers and different things, and there's a lot of turnover, right? And more than normal in college football. I think that back end, they may be a lot worse than we anticipated. And, I'm not sure that I would necessarily expect Georgia to dominate to that extent every week. I think we may find that Oregon is below average defensively, maybe on a national level. And so that's kind of my problem with trying to evaluate it all. And I will say, Ohio State finally hit a deep post over the middle of the field and took the lead over Notre Dame. I kind of been waiting for that to happen. I picked Notre Dame to lose this game by a lot. A lot of Notre Dame fans are probably going to give me hell for that. But I'll also say, Notre Dame offensively has done about what I expected in this game. Ohio State, I just thought with their receiving core and every game they had last year, this is a team that should not be held to 7 points and a half. When that happens, something's wrong. And I don't really feel too bad for not predicting it. I don't think anybody really did. This is the same roster that lit up Utah in the bowl game. And they're just, to this point, they really haven't looked like the same team, but let's see if they turn it on. And I think they could midway through the third or the fourth quarter. They could put points up in a hurry if they just get things together.
They could. But this is another team, Josh, that's physical on the lines that has given Ohio State trouble. So is that something that until proven otherwise, we need to assume that Ohio State's got some problems there?
Yeah. I mean, I generally take the pessimistic view. I think most fans take the optimistic view of their team. I tend to make you prove it to me at this level. And I think that's the conversation, right? Is that Ohio State's trying to say they're an elite offense with complete elite dynamics. And at that level, you need to prove it. So, we'll see. We'll see how that goes. I'm going to have to step away really quickly. Apparently my power cable is, I guess, not plugged into the wall correctly because my battery's about to die. So
you can turn your camera off too if you want, or leave it on. So let's run through a little bit of the chat. So some Marlon says Georgia is number one. Maybe we just talked about that a little bit. I was really impressed with what Georgia did. I do think it was a terrible matchup for Oregon. The thing for me, I was not shocked that Georgia scored in the 40s. I was shocked at how bad Oregon's wide receivers were, which kept them from even getting into the kind of 20s area where we thought they might get. Alabama, and we'll get into this later because it's not y'all, I'm just, in case you're curious, trim tab, Sabro Singularity, not as good as their Mosaic. I'm burping a little bit. So Bryce Young was a little rusty, and I know he put up some numbers, but a little rusty tonight. And especially in the red zone, end zone, he sailed a number of passes to some open receivers. But I was interested to see the 100 yards from him. Looks like Florida just scored. Anthony Richardson just punched it in. Napier's super happy. They're hugging, but the game ain't over, which is crazy. That might be something that we see again. So what I think we both picked Florida by 3, I think. So this one, it might go our way unless Utah marches it down the field and scores. We haven't done great against the spread today, but yeah, I mean, Marlon, you're saying they beat a top 15 team by 46 points. They beat a top 15 team coming out of August. So unless you really think that preseason polls matter a lot, and you think that Oregon is the 11th best team in the country, like, look, I think Georgia's great. They're 1 or 2, and I probably have them 1, but I don't think that. I think that we're overselling Oregon a little bit based on that number 11. Remember, this Utah team beat them like 38-7, 38-7 in 2 out of 3 weeks last year to end the season. So I think that honestly, the one thing that I'm really, if I'm encouraged from looking at Alabama, talking about who should be number 1, we had a little concern with these new wide receivers. And look, Marlon, if you think that Oregon's the 11th best team in the country, go for it. But I just disagree. With Alabama, I was excited to see, from them what we got out of the wide receivers. I was excited from Georgia to see what we got out of the wide receivers there too, because we flagged that for both of these teams coming in, that there might be there's some new faces there. Georgia relied a lot on tight ends last year, and they didn't have to today. A lot of passing yards of running back too. But let's not get too excited on what happened against Oregon today. It's a long season. Having said that, I don't see anybody on Georgia's schedule beating them. It's like, what do we know about this team until they play Alabama? The kicker, and I don't know if Josh, if you're talking about the kicker, there's somebody in the chat that says, I feel terrible for their kicker. I'm assuming you're talking about the ECU kicker today. That was terrible. There's a lot of people in chat saying Alabama is obviously number 1. And I think some of that is because Alabama started number 1. But again, preseason polls, they don't matter much. You can shuffle around. Yeah, ECU kicker, he missed extra point, and then they drove the ball down, and he missed the field goal. So Utah's got the ball, and they are just completed a pass. This will be interesting to me because, this might go to overtime because they only need a field goal. Okay, so y'all hit me up in the chat. Let's see what we're going to talk about. Is Florida underrated? I don't know. Like, they're not currently ranked, so clearly they're underrated. What's wild, and you talk about preseason polls or polling in general, Utah's the number 7 team in the country based on, AP and preseason polls. They're coming here number 7. Florida's unranked. Florida's currently leading them, and Utah was only a 3-point favorite. So we talk about playoff expansion. We talk about the gaps between the second best team and however much. The gaps between the 5th best team and what is currently unranked is apparently only, or 7th best team is only 3 points. And that's wild to me. So that's where I think that Utah is Florida underrated. We don't know where to rank people right now. What do you do with Utah and Florida tomorrow? They both played a great game, but they've played each other. So is Utah the 7th best team in the country? That means Florida is too in that area? Or are both of these teams about the 15th best team in the country, which I think is probably closer to reality?
Yeah, and I'm finally back. Sorry, I guess I had a bad USB-C cable, so fun times. But I think the most difficult thing in week 1 always, right, is trying to evaluate teams after they play each other. Because if you think Utah is whatever they were supposed to be, and Florida were to beat them, that means Florida probably ought to be considered a top 10 team. Or do you think Utah is just not what you thought they were supposed to be, and that Florida is, in which case Utah is probably not a top 15 team and Florida isn't either? Usually we do split the baby, and we'll come in somewhere, Florida will be number 11, Utah will be number 15 or 16 or something like that. And people just sort of guesstimate it and let it fix itself later. It doesn't really matter, truth be told, in week 2, right? Like, it doesn't matter. I think before the football playoff committee when AP poll mattered in the BCS formula or whatnot. It was important because there's so much momentum with where you start ranked and how you climb up or climb down. But I do think the playoff committee, to their credit, does completely do the rankings from scratch when they start every year. I don't think they care really too much what the AP or the coaches poll says. So at this point, it's a little academic. We'll know where they are in a few weeks. For our purposes, it's going to be tough as heck. And let me ask you a question, right? So we see this game coming down to the wire. How much does it matter to you at this point who wins this game? Like, does it really move the needle? Obviously, I'm going to rank the team that wins higher, but how much does it move the needle collectively to you if one team wins or the other? Because for me, I'm not sure it really does.
I'll be honest. I think this was a well-played game against two about 15 best teams in the country. I don't see top 10. I still see some limitations from Richardson at quarterback. I just do. I think he's got 160 something passing yards. He runs a lot. He bails a lot. His first thought is to run, which is going to bake in some limitations. And, regardless of whether you do this or not, like voters do, Utah is going to end up ranked higher than Florida because Florida's got just an awful schedule. Their schedule is brutal. Remember, they still got to play LSU. They got to play what's probably an improved Florida State team. I think they've got Texas A&M. Obviously, they got Georgia every year. So Florida could lose to like 3 top 10 teams and be barely ranked. But to your question, I think that right now, yeah, like who wins doesn't really matter. I think they're about the same team, although Utah playing on the road in this crazy humidity and keeping up has been pretty good. I will say this though, and Josh, what do you think about this? Like, what do you think about the point I just made? Like, Utah is going to go back and play in the Pac-12, while Florida's going to have to go and play in the SEC. Utah is going to look better in terms of clean record, right?
Yeah, and however it goes, I'm going to keep this game in my mind a little bit. That I felt like they were pretty evenly matched physically. I mean, Utah certainly played well this game, and they're Cam Rising going down. Looks like this game is going to come down to the wire if they kick a field goal to tie. But however their record comes out and Florida's record comes out, it is kind of a barometer for where those two conferences are. And I'm not saying it's everything, but it is a lot, right? We don't have many ways to compare across conferences. I always say it's like looking at Polaroids of the Himalayas and a Polaroid of the Andes Mountains. How do you know which one's taller? They both look like mountain peaks, right? So whenever you have the opportunity to see two things side by side, you have to keep that into mind all the way through the year, because it does give you an idea where the talent level is relative between the two teams. And because that between the two teams, you can kind of extrapolate a little bit from the conferences. Assuming Utah is, substantially more physical than other teams in the Pac-12, which has been the case the past few years. Man, these games, looks like Ohio State finally seems to be turning it around a little bit. Notre Dame got an offensive PI now, and they're backed up, but at the same time, you got that mile in the Florida game in the corner with Utah, kind of wrapping along with everybody else. It's kind of hard to stay focused. I'm trying to think anything else we want to discuss. I mean, is there anything else we want to talk about?
Well, I mean, I think we just saw it again, and we talked about this earlier. Cam Rising, 3rd and 7, runs up the middle for 30 yards. I think that there's too many things that we've seen that haven't been great from both of these teams for me to think that either one of them is much better than about 15th. But like you said, this is a good barometer. If Utah goes back and just shreds the Pac-12, although it's looking like USC might be an interesting game at some point, and Florida really struggles in the SEC, I think that's pretty telling. I think it, and I do think that our it's funny, we got a lot of Georgia people in the chat because that game's long gone. I think we'll get a lot more Ohio State people, assuming they pull this one out. Early games today, 2 games in the state of North Carolina that were crazy. The Appalachian State UNC game, that was nuts. I cannot believe that guy fielded that onside kick and ran it in. Like, that almost ultimately cost him the game. The poor kicker at ECU, I feel terrible for him, but also, like, I feel terrible for his team because they did their job and got him in position. But Drake May, like he looked pretty good, former Alabama commit. But is UNC just that kind of team that's just going to put up a bunch of points but probably lose 4 or 5 games a year because they're going to give up 50?
I mean, we've seen for a couple weeks now, right? And it definitely seems to be the case. I mean, Drake May looks like a dude, and you got to give them a lot of credit for landing him. He was a big-time recruit, kind of giving a lot of stability to their program. At the same time, I sit here kind of wondering where they would be at if they didn't have May, because the defense does not look good. And what's kind of sad about it is I don't think they're untalented. The angles aren't great. The execution is not good. The scheme doesn't seem completely sound. I don't think that's a well-coached defense. Like, they just don't play well. So, that does leave the door open for them to play better down the latter half of the year. But, I mean, the defense is really good. Or the defense isn't really good. The offense is really good. But that actually, let me transition to another team here while we're waiting, because I'm sure the Florida fans, the Utah fans, however this game turns out, are going to want to talk about it. Same with the Ohio State fans. I'm kind of trying to hold some thoughts on those games. You want to talk a minute about Texas A&M? Because we talk about great quarterback play and a bad defense. Man, if you watch the first half of that Texas A&M game, they've got problems. Because the last year, the excuse was the quarterback got injured. We were on the same boat with everybody else. Haynes King is very inconsistent. He's very inaccurate. He does not go through progressions. He threw a number of passes that were, just sort of like blatant stare down the receiver. Didn't see a guy rolling, a corner rolling underneath or a safety rolling down, and he just threw right to him. That's not going to go well in SEC play. And to cap it off, he's a really athletic guy. He can, he's a very, very fast runner. I don't think he's a natural runner. He goes down awkward and it goes down easy. Without Spiller to give them some semblance of power and give them a power running game. Now you're relying on A-Chain, but A-Chain's not going to break a lot of arm tackles with 300-pound defensive linemen. That becomes a much more vulnerable team. As I say that, by the way, Florida gets an interception in the end zone. That's going to seal the game. So Florida's going to win over Utah. Pretty brutal mistake. I mean, part of this conversation, right? The mistakes you see from King are frequently the same sort of thing that just happened with Utah. It just takes one of those bad reads.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's almost like you set up the interception by talking about Haynes King.
But it's true, right? Like those, there was one play in particular. I put a YouTube short, which I did a terrible job of it because I've never used it before. But Haynes King threw a pass and ended up being caught over a DB. But my point was the DB was rolling off coverage and Haynes King had no idea he was there. So if that was a better DB from an SEC program, that's an interception. And if you're in a game like Utah is, Haynes King is going to lose them ball games. And their defense is phenomenal, but you're not going to win many games if you're throwing. Not only is the offense not producing, but it's turnover prone. It's going to be hard to win 10 or 11 games with that kind of a mode, like a lot of A&M fans are expecting.
Well, and that's the thing that, like, I think that Haynes King is one of these people that in 7-on-7 looks amazing. But when he has to read a defense, everything seems so slow. And this is a guy that I know he's hurt last year, but he's been in college for a minute. He's not a, come out of high school kind of guy. He's been through these programs. He should know the offense. He reacts incredibly slow, and then he has a slow windup to boot. So he's not getting it out there, and he's getting it. By the time the break is gone. He put up some numbers today, but I made a note on Twitter at the half. He had, if you take away the 2 coverage busts, he had all of A&M had 122 yards of offense. And that's like Iowa numbers. Speaking of segues, Iowa with 56 yards in the first half, Josh, 7 points, 4 coming from the defense. Is this just a situation? I know Iowa's been mediocre on offense for a while, but is this a situation where, like, nepotism at the offensive coordinator position, as much as Kirk Ferentz is loved there, should maybe get him fired?
Yeah, I mean, my wife read me a headline that said 2 second-half safeties allow Iowa to pull away in a victory. Hardest fought touchdown in college football for that game to end 7-3.
That's the toughest way to get it.
Yeah, I know. I mean that. Look, I am not a huge Ferentz believer. I think he's a good coach. He's given a lot of consistency to that program. I don't understand the level of stability and pay that he receives. I don't get it. I just don't, because a lot of college football is about signing really high level recruiting classes and building an offense that's very effective. Your defense is never going to be good enough in the RPO era to really be overly successful at a high level. And there's going to be years where Iowa has turnover. And if they have turnover with the level of offense they're put on the field in the last few years, I mean, they're going to have a really, really rough season. So, I mean, I don't know. There's no way they can ever let Ferentz go. I forget what his contract is, but it's insane, which is still even more ridiculous when you consider that I don't think anyone was really looking to poach him. Yeah,
they
it's one
love
of the
him,
things that looks like a genius. Yeah, it looks like a genius move if you keep him, but you don't give somebody a ton of money just because you love him if no one else wants him. I mean, that's the LSU Ed Orgeron mistake, right?
Yeah.
Like you give him money to keep him at the program because somebody else wants to take him from you. That's why you give somebody a big contract.
So we've got dueling super chats regarding CFP expansion. You knew we had to talk about it at some point tonight. We'll probably do a standalone video on this, but Darius asked us to talk about it. Thank you for the super chat. And then Stephen Light kind of let him know that we hate it more than words can describe, but we're going to give you some words to describe how much we hate it. But before we talk about what we hate about it, Josh, I'm going to force you, because we talked about it yesterday a little bit. I'm going to force you to tell me some things that you actually like about the proposed playoff expansion.
Some things I actually like about it. I think the biggest thing that I like about the playoff expansion is the fact that there's really two prongs that I do like. One, there is the reality that a lot of New Year's Six Bowls had become just done out of the gate, right? Oklahoma fans don't want to hear it. You didn't play Florida after 2020. You played Florida's third string. You know, I counted it up. There were like three third string players on defense. The majority of the defense was second or third string players. They didn't play a single starting skill position player from Florida other than the quarterback. And that includes Kyle Pitts and a receiver, Kadarius Toney, that's turns out he's pretty good. So it was a big deal that those guys weren't in that game. It wasn't shocking that they destroyed Florida, but it also meant the sort of culmination for that whole season was a just total loss. And it was a shame for Florida fans. It was a shame, I think, for Oklahoma fans because they didn't get to see, you know, they have to live with the whole, you know, yes, I know we've always said they won that game fair and square, but you didn't really get to evaluate the team the way you would have liked at the end of the year, and certainly for the national college football landscape. So I do think the playoff is good in from the respect that it's probably going to cause people to actually play in the postseason. The other thing I will say, there is a little bit of merit to the argument that teams making it into the playoff keeps them sort of relevant, right? Like if you're in the Pac-12 and you've lost 2 games, but you know the Pac-12 gets an automatic qualifier slot, at least the teams competing for the Pac-12 title are going to stay interested through the end of the year because they know that somebody is going to go to the playoff. And maybe fans will watch because they think they'll get a playoff slot. Now, all that said, I think that's going to be really interesting for probably about 3 years until people realize the way the first round of the playoffs is going to go on a continual basis. But, you know, I think we screwed a lot of stuff up with the playoffs and being accepting of opt-outs and all that kind of stuff. And maybe this sort of buys us a few more years of good football.
Darius Williams with another super chat said Pac-12 can't handle SEC East teams, but wants a shot in the playoffs. And that's kind of what we've said in the past. Like 2018, Washington loses 3 games, wins the Pac-12. Who did they play in their opener? The 6th best team in the SEC in Auburn, a team that Alabama beat by, I think, 32 points or something like that. Georgia crushed them too. That's the kind of thing that, like, we don't need to see that game. And even if you can kind of circle the wagons and prepare for a month and beat a really good team, you're not going to beat 3 in a row, for starters. And second off, you didn't earn the right to be on the field with that team. Last year, the G5 auto qualifier, so the 6th team, would have been Louisiana. Because if you think about it, everybody's like, oh, well, now we're going to get UCF in there. Now we're going to get Memphis in there. Now we're going to get, you know, I think it's 2015 Houston. They're going to be in the playoffs. No, because now they're in the Big 12 or the Pac-12 when we do realignment, what's good G5s now are going to be P5 teams, which also waters down the concept of P5. That's another story. But what you were left with in the playoffs last year would have been a Louisiana team that lost to 5-7 Texas, 38-18, playing a Bama or Georgia or whatever. And the 12th ranked team in the country was Pitt. Pitt lost to Western Michigan, and they lost to a team that Alabama beat by 30 points in Miami. That team does not deserve to be on the playing field with Georgia or Alabama or whatever. We saw what Michigan was doing to teams last year and then what Georgia did to them. It's not fair that Georgia has to endure injuries in an opening round game against a team that lost to Western Michigan. I'm sorry. So now Pitt loses to Western Michigan, and they're like, doesn't matter. We can keep playing. Oh, lost to Miami. Doesn't matter. As long as we win our crappy conference, because Clemson's down this year, then we'll be in the playoffs. And that's all we're playing for, is a shot at the playoffs, because nothing else matters anymore. That's really disappointing.
Yeah, and we've done a couple breakdowns on it, right? Talking about the reality of how this AQ format would work out. Look, let me be clear. I think 12 is a better number than 8, because I'd rather see 5 play 12, 6 play 11, etc., than 1 play 8. That most years 1, 2, 3 versus 8, 7, 6 are major mismatches, excepting the times when you have like a 2-loss Ohio State or Alabama or somebody that's floating in that realm. But the problem is the automatic qualifier, format that they're using. Having 6 automatic qualifiers, and especially saying the top 4 teams have to be conference champions, is not good in this realignment format, right? Oklahoma and Texas are going to be in the SEC. USC and Cal are going to be in the Big Ten. So, the SEC and the Big Ten are only ever allowed to have 2 of the 4. One thing I haven't had answered yet is if Notre Dame is allowed to be one of the 4, which if they are, I think that's absolutely freaking absurd that, an 11-1 SEC team, or like last year's 12-1 Georgia, can't be number 3, but Notre Dame can without having to play in a conference championship. Hopefully they're just required to have an at-large bid. But yeah, it's really bad. I think last year, right? I think I said it was, if you look at where everybody's going to be post alignment, I think it was like Utah that would end up being the number 4 seed, who is the number 6 or number 7 overall team. And then because you have all these automatic qualifiers, again, you think in a post realignment context, Cincinnati and Baylor are going to be in the same conference. So only one of them gets an AQ slot, and you've got to have 6 AQs. So the last AQ goes every year. It's going to go to a G5 team. There's only 5 P5. So you have to have at least one G5, but BYU, Cincinnati, UCF, Houston are not G5s. So last year, the best team was Fresno State. Like a lot of other years is going to be Air Force or Memphis, and they're going to be like 2 or 3 lost G5s that maybe lost by like 4 touchdowns. I think, what was the year? 2019, right? Cincinnati, I think they ended the year the top G5 champion, and they lost to Ohio State in regular season. Memphis.
Cincinnati lost the last game of the year, regular season game, to Memphis by like 4 or 5, and then lost the conference championship game to Memphis by 4 or 5. And that's the team that Ohio State beat 42-0, and it could have been 70-0.
Yeah, I mean that.
And that Memphis team, by the way, got destroyed by Penn State in their bowl game.
The justification there and this is because it's presidents making this formula, right? So it was decided by the presidents and the commission, and it's going to be handed back to the people that are football people to sort of iron out the exact details. The proposal was given before realignment, right? So it made a lot more sense when BYU and Cincinnati and UCF were G5s. You could kind of stomach it. But without that, now I don't think it makes sense. The idea behind it is that every year the G5 gets included. So the presidents want to make sure we have inclusion. But, if the G5 is actually good enough to make the playoff, they will get in the top 12. It's not that hard to be a top 12 team. It's really not.
Especially as a G5, when you're getting rid of all the good G5s to go into P5. So it's like, oh, you got to win your big game against UAB and Temple, and have a clean record. And then, because we've seen the voters dying to overrank mediocre G5s just because they have a clean record. We've seen that in the past. So you're right. Being top 12 is not that hard.
Right. So Boise State, when they were in their heyday with Kellen Moore, they were consistently a top 10 team at the end of the year. UCF, when their best season, they were number 8. It's Utah, when they beat Alabama, I think they were number 4 in the country.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, if you're a really high level G5, you can make top 12. The problem is so many of these teams that we're naming, UCF and Utah, are not G5s anymore. And it's not because people traded places. It's just the Power 5 expanded basically to absorb the better parts of the G5. And quite frankly, they expanded to absorb most of the G5 that ever has any shot of ever being relevant. So whatever low-level chance you had of a UCF being competitive with like an Alabama, the odds of Air Force and Fresno State being competitive with Georgia and Alabama are beyond remote. So I really don't like a 12-team playoff where one game in the first round. And last year, realize, your highest seed of the first round, your first non-bye team, will always or almost always going to end up being the highest ranked non-conference or non-champion, right? Usually one conference has 2 teams that are highly ranked. One is not a champion, and that's usually higher than whatever the 5th champion is. Last year it'd be Georgia. So Georgia goes into the playoff and effectively plays Fresno State and beats them like 40 to nothing. And because of that, they actually get some advantages the way seeding plays out. It's a crappy format and it's a dumb idea. I'm really, really hoping they scrap a lot of it or at least sort of curtail it. Because as it's currently set out, I think it's not good. It's going to make the playoff a lot worse than if they just ranked it best to worst, 1 to 12. I still wouldn't love it, but best to worst 1 to 12 would be a heck of a lot better than this AQ hybrid monstrosity
Josh,
that they've created.
Here's the frustrating thing is like, to me, I don't understand why we can't acknowledge reality. Why can't we acknowledge the fact that like a lot of this realignment is going to happen? Like you said, they started thinking through this before all this realignment took place. Why can't we acknowledge the reality that in the coming years, a 9-3 UAB either shouldn't get an AQ or shouldn't be one of the top, ranked whatever, a 3-loss Pac-12 because they won their conference championship should not be ranked ahead of a team. This is what we're going to get, Josh. We're going to get these like guaranteed home field advantage, whatever 3-loss Pac-12 champion. We're going to get them as a higher seed being a 2 or 3 touchdown underdog to the second best team in the Big Ten East. That's what we're going to get. Like,
yeah,
it's just ridiculous.
Yeah, it I was talking about last year, right? That you talk alignment or post alignment. If you play where the teams were at, I think it was Cincinnati and Baylor that get the last 2 slots. Otherwise, it ends up with Cincinnati and Utah. It's not really great that the 4th champion always gets a bye, because there have been years, I think, was it 2018 we were processing, right? Washington is an automatic qualifier, and they were a 3-loss team that lost to Auburn in the opener. And Auburn was like, weren't they like a 5-loss team that year? They weren't particularly good.
They were the 6th best team in the SEC, and Alabama beat them, I think, like 52-20, something like that.
It's not a great thing. And there have been many, many years where the 4th best P5 champion is not someone that can stay on the field with a lot of other teams.
Well, that's why they didn't get in the playoffs, right? Like, that's why the 4th best team in the champion many years hasn't made it to the playoffs, because the committee's like, look, Utah, you lost to San Diego State and BYU. You're not beating Georgia, so let's put Georgia in.
Yeah, it's just not good. And I think everybody's thought process is, oh, there's more football, be more good football because good teams play competitive games. And they're not understanding that the majority of games played between numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I mean into the season. I don't mean Michigan at the start of 2007, because the team that lost to App State beginning of 2007, everything can happen. They lost 35-7 to Oregon the next week. They ended up being a 4-loss team, if I remember right. So, yeah, sometimes teams are way overranked early in the year, and sometimes beginning of the year, good teams don't play well, right? Alabama losing to Texas A&M last year, who, by the way, ended up being a pretty good team. They're just kind of ships crossing in the night to a certain extent. No, when you're talking end of the season, top teams, they're usually in rare form, and all that talent that Ohio State and Georgia and Alabama and LSU amasses really starts to coalesce, and they become, I won't say unbeatable, but it's something kind of close to it a lot of times. And so, yeah, maybe you get an upset, but I think I was looking at the FEI win probabilities of different rankings, and Oregon's win probability against Georgia in FEI, and this was just preseason projection, so it's obviously pretty loose, and frankly that means it's giving them a higher chance because it doesn't know Georgia. It was still 7%, and that was FEI number, I think it was number 3 versus number 11. They had a 7% chance of winning. And I looked at historically where March Madness would be, and that is the average win percentage of a 6.3% is a 15 seed in March Madness against a 2 seed. So you're basically every playoff game is going to be something like a 14 through a 16 seed. It's, people think of it like all these 12 seeds that get upset, and everywhere time you have a 16 seed that upsets a 1 seed. It's just not going to happen. I mean, you're going to have one of those upsets like once every 4 or 5 years, and the rest of the time it's going to be chalk. You're going to get like probably 70 to 80% blowouts would be my expectation over the course of a bracket. And again, that's greatly made much worse because of the AQ thing, the way they're going to seed it. It's not going to be seeded competitively, so blowouts are going to be that much more common. And it also means good teams are going to end up playing each other early, and so that that you give this token seed to the a 2-loss Utah, right? That forces Alabama and Georgia, for example, last year they play in the semis, they don't play in the final because Georgia is not a top 4 team. I'm frustrated. I don't despise going to a 12-team playoff in principle. I really, really, really am not happy with the way that they're going to do it.
I don't like being basically gaslit by administration in having to pretend that winning the Pac-12, especially post realignment, when UCLA, USC, and Stanford and whoever else goes to the Big Ten, when winning the Pac-12 but losing to BYU and San Diego State, I have to pretend that team is better than Georgia. I don't like that. I don't like that I'm being asked to pretend that 3-loss MAC champion belongs in the playoffs at all. And I'm frustrated because I want that 3-loss MAC champion to play 8-4 Mississippi State and have a good bowl game. And I'm going to watch it in early December. Cody Hayes said something that a lot of people are saying that I kind of agreed with at first, but now I really disagree with now that I've thought about it. And he said that the 12-team playoff is going to encourage big-time matchups. And I'm assuming he's saying out-of-conference scheduling, because now that you maybe have a mulligan, your OOC scheduling will lead you to free yourself to play a really good team because you're not scared if you take a loss. I totally disagree with that, because what you're going to do is you're going to want to take your mulligan in conference on the way to the conference championship, but make sure you ensure a top 12 ranking. What's a good way to ensure a top 12 ranking? Sorry. Do what Michigan's doing this year. They opened with Colorado State today, who was 3-9 last year, who lost by 20 points to the Utah State team Alabama's up 55-0 on. That's the best team that Michigan plays out of conference this year. They've got 3 wins baked in, which means in a future 12-game or 12-team playoff scenario, you want as clean a record as possible. You're going to give yourself your mulligan in conference. If I don't win my conference, no big deal, as long as I have enough guaranteed wins, guaranteed home games, guaranteed games against crappy teams to ensure that these voters are going to put me in, because they're going to say, oh, you went 10-2 and you're a good brand name. You didn't do great in your conference, but you went 10-2. So let's put you in the playoffs. That's what's going to happen. You're going to have less big-time matchups because this incentivizes gaming the system to make sure you're in that top 12 even more, because that's actually easier than winning your conference.
Yeah, and people may say, well, but the teams at the top of the heap, they're going to want to play these games, right? Because then they're going to want to seed to be number 1 through number 4. Let me give you a quick note so you understand this. They're already playing those games. I am watching Notre Dame play Ohio State right now. Alabama is going to go play at Texas next week. Alabama scheduled a home-and-home with Ohio State, which means Ohio State scheduled with Alabama. Those games are already on the books. The only thing that you would be looking is sort of the second tier teams. And those are the teams that are not playing major out of conference games for all the reasons that Daniel just talked about, because they know they really want to make the playoff for a New Year's Six bowl and they don't want an extra loss. Those teams don't want to burn their mulligan losing to Alabama, right? Florida State doesn't want to open with Alabama. If they feel like they're going to be in a turnaround program in 5 years, they want to be in a position where, maybe they drop 1 or 2 games in conference. They drop 2 games in conference, lose to Clemson as one of those 2, beat 3 cupcakes. They end the season 10-2. No, they got a pretty good shot to be top 12. If they play Alabama and they finish 9-3, not so good a shot. And so, I don't think people are going to, at most, I don't think anything's going to change. I actually think there's an incentive for it to get worse. I don't think it really will, because I think people still want to try to play some sort of notable out-of-conference game for a variety of reasons. But I certainly don't think people are going to start scheduling 2 of them, right, because of this playoff structure. I just don't think that's going to happen. The only way that's going to happen is a separate independent initiative for, hey, let's all play 2 out-of-conference games against P5 teams. But just because of the 12-team playoff and some sort of seeding advantage, I don't buy it. I'm sorry, I just don't buy it. I don't buy the argument.
Yeah, and Eric, thank you for the super chat. Eric said he can see playoff expanding these 16 games in college football going back to 11 games a year. What do you think? I actually don't think that's the case. I think it should. I think if they're going to make these players play these games and, just take the toll on their body while they're also asking them to go to class and all this stuff, I think it's ridiculous that they're adding 2 more games. Like, think of Alabama, Ohio State 2020. If either one of those teams had to play another game after that one, they would have been a shell of themselves. And whoever beat them wouldn't have been the real champion, because the real champion wasn't there. Half of their team was injured. Devonta Smith broke his finger. Mac Jones was banged up. Alabama was already and Ohio State was just in an infirmary ward. So, I think they should go back to games. But the problem is, you go from 12 to 16. That's 4 more teams. That's 2 more games versus 60 games that you get to make money off of, sell tickets to. You got 2 games that you can sell tickets to and make money off of versus 60 games. And even if they're crappy teams or whatever, and they're only putting, 30,000 people in the seats, it's still part of TV packages. They're still selling those weekends, that sort of thing. And so I don't think that's going to happen. That's actually why they added the 12th game, because they were talking about playoffs and all of that, and they did the 12 games in the conference championships. They added those games instead of having it just take part in the season, because they realized when they looked at it on paper, it's 60, 65 games if you just add 1 more, even if it's a cupcake.
Right. Yeah. You add 1, you take a week off everybody's schedule to add 1. So, no, and that actually brings up one more point, and then, maybe we can turn the conversation now, because it looks like Ohio State is kneeling out to win the game against Notre Dame, who I think they conceded it when they punted 2 scores down with very little time left. They knew this game was over, but the real revenue in college football, and it's almost a unique thing in sports, comes from the regular season. They don't make a ton of money off playoffs or bowl games. Yes, it's a decent amount of revenue and it does matter, but it's a few $1 million per team generally. The TV contracts that the Big Ten are signing right now is rumored to be somewhere pushing $80 million a year. Okay, so like $60 to $80 million with between TV and all the endorsements and everything that's tied up in it. The bowl games don't really make a huge percentage difference in anything. The playoffs don't really either. The money is in all the regular season games. It's the whole package. It's the fact that you've got, like Daniel's saying, really 15 games played weekly over the course of 13 weeks. That's a lot of games, guys. And so that's where the money is. And I don't think you're ever going to see too much more of a shift to playoffs. Yes, it's a ton of money because you get a lot of eyeballs in those games, but it's a balancing act, and it's only going to be so big. I also don't think – I think we get to 12 and they'll go a few years. And if it plays out the way I think it will, maybe I think you're more likely to see a restructuring of the format within 12 than ever expanding.
I think
so that's pretty interesting.
Probably what makes the most sense with realignment is a whole separate division of college football and maybe fewer games. But we got to get to some super chats. Shane Bentley said the Stark's interception was very snazzy. Had a heck of a first game. Dogs really impressed me today. Go Dogs. We talked about it earlier. I don't know if you're on, Shane, but we're kind of debating, like, do we put Georgia number one? Alabama slaughtered their opponent too, but Georgia beat a named opponent. We're not sold on Oregon being maybe even good this year, and it makes a lot of sense. Utah, like we said, beat them 38-7 twice, I think, last year. But I think that it's so hard for us to get away from the brand name of who Oregon has been over the last 15 years or so to really think anything less of that Georgia win or to try to water it down in any way. Georgia again today was just a massive efficiency monster. I think we've got another super chat. Okay, so Josh Kiltack9, big friend of the program, says it looks like Bama versus Georgia already. What would throw a wrinkle in that, what looks to be a collision course? How do we avoid that?
Well, the best way to avoid it is one of them to lose in the regular season, because they're going to have to play each other in the conference championship game, and we've never had a two-loss conference champion or non-champion play in the playoff, right? Ohio State lost 2 games. They got kept out for a non-champion Alabama. So I would think if one of them loses 2 games, they probably won't make it. You need to be rooting for somebody else in the SEC to show up. LSU, you got to root for Florida to be the real deal and catch them. The truth is, man, I don't really know where it's going to come from. I don't think it's a spoiler to say that I wouldn't pick Texas to beat them. Alabama right now, we'll do a preview on that and say exactly where I'm at. But I mean, I'm certainly not going to pick Texas to win. So you've got to hope somebody reaches up and bites them so that when they play in that conference championship game, if they're both 11-1, one of them's going to come away and be 11-2, and then somebody else probably walks into it. I mean, Ohio State, we talked about the fact that they were kind of sleepwalking, and they did. I think the end of the game kind of got their act together, and they looked like what they could have looked like the whole ball game. So Ohio State being who they need to be, maybe knocking off one of them in a semis, it seems like the only other answer, right? Because I don't see anybody else in college football that looks like they're on their level. And Alabama, you're saying 55-0, but you felt like, I watched a little bit of Alabama at the start, and I watched, essentially every snap of that Georgia game. Georgia was so good they looked like they were playing air, and I don't buy that Oregon's a great team. I talked earlier about the fact that Oregon's wide receivers were just making huge explosive plays in the spring game. They were throwing some interceptions, and the ball was just flying around either way. And then I watch them play Georgia, and suddenly those receivers don't look all that explosive, and Georgia has guys wide open. I think the DBs were just bad more than the receivers were good, and I think we may see that trend play through. But still, for Georgia to do what they're doing to a team like Oregon that is quite talented, that has 5-star linebackers, man, they made them look like an FCS team, and that's not easy to do. So those two teams do definitely seem like they're on a collision course for sure.
I will say, like, Oregon moved the ball between the 20s a little bit. If Bo Nix doesn't go Bo Nix a couple of times, they probably put up 17-ish points. I think against let's look at it like this. Like, I think that if Georgia played Ohio State or Notre Dame tonight, they would have beaten them pretty bad. Maybe that's not fair to say, but what do you think, Josh?
Yeah, if they play tonight, I mean, it's harder to judge Alabama, so I'll reserve that a little bit because Utah State's a pretty good team. I will say they're an 11-win team last year. That wasn't Colorado State that they just annihilated. But Georgia playing what should be at least a reasonable P5 team to do that. Yeah, it's hard to see them not blowing out most everyone I've seen play football this week. There's a lot of weeks left to play. Teams don't always look the same week one. I saw one of the best teams in the last decade in Ohio State in 2014 lose to a rather mediocre Virginia Tech team early in the season. I mean, that happens a lot early in the year when teams aren't coalesced and you don't know who's the right player for the right position and all that. The talent hasn't really come together yet. And it's particularly true because these teams have so many new starters. And I think people forget that's like the second or third start these guys have ever had. And they just look like a completely different team in their 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th start. So, I do agree with you. And now that this Ohio State Notre Dame game finished, you want to have a longer conversation about our thoughts on that game? We touched on it early on, but I'm sure we've picked up a lot of Ohio State fans now.
I do, but I want to get to a couple of super chats first, and maybe let a few more Ohio State fans stream in. Josh said, speaking of FCS, I find it interesting how people really want a playoff expansion aren't aware how top heavy it is there too. NDSU has won 9 of the past 11 tourneys, which is funny because, Josh, what do people say to us all the time on Twitter? Every other sport and every other division has figured this out. Not FBS college football. FCS has it all figured out. They have a tournament and they let everybody, play or whatever. And look what we got. If Alabama, like, you think it's bad now with Alabama winning every third year or whatever, imagine if they won 9 of 11. Like, I guess then they would have to expand it to 24 or 30. They're just going to keep expanding until they realize that, like, the best way to keep Alabama, Ohio State, or Georgia out of the playoffs in a given year is to have a small field and make them be perfect. Because the sneaky, untold rule in all of this is Alabama's playing a way tougher schedule than a lot of teams. And in a lot of these years where Alabama won the national championship, if it was the BCS formula, it would have been a less good, honestly, team than Alabama in their place because you're only selecting 2. And
2017. I mean,
yeah,
Alabama does not make the playoff in 2017, right?
And was Georgia the 2 seed last year? I think they did that to avoid.
They were 3.
Okay, so yeah, so last year Georgia doesn't make it last year. So Michigan's in the championship game last year. So that's the way you keep them out, not giving them the ability to lose 2 games and still make it in. Because then you've got 2010 Alabama going in and just raking because they were the best team in the country at the end of the year. 2015 Ohio State, super talented team. End of the year, they're making it in. So I can't go too much further on that. We got some more super chats.
Well,
Stephen Light.
I will add one thing, which is you say 9 of 11, but it's really more like 10 of 11 because the only reason North Dakota State didn't win in 2020 is that Trey Lance and a lot of the other guys opted out of the season because they were going to the NFL.
They opted out of the playoffs?
Yeah, they opted out like second week of the year. The most of that squad opted out. So, yeah, North Dakota State with a guy that's starting for the current 49ers would have won the SEC FCS championship. It would have been 10 of 11. So just 9 of 11's even really not telling the story. It was 10 of 11, but for COVID. So, yeah, that's how lopsided FCS has become.
Stephen Light said the academic president screwed this up trying to save conferences. Here's where I wish the SEC and the big thing had just called it a crush move and divided up between the 2 conferences. I think that's where we're headed, honestly, because I think that what we're going to see with the Big 12 and the Pac-12 is what we talked about before. So, okay, if you think about the most recent done realignment, we added Utah into the Pac-12, who was not a Power 5. We added TCU into the Big 12, wasn't a Power 5. Utah's doing pretty well. TCU's not doing great. They've kind of petered out. We're going to do another round of realignment where the Big 10 and the SEC get stronger, and we're kind of backfilling into a P5 conference a bunch of G5 teams. At some point, because we know how talent distribution works in college football, at some point, these P5s, like the Pac-12 is already a very weak P5. So now what happens when we add a couple of G5s to them to replace 2 of their biggest brand names? I mean, I think it's a little bit ridiculous. And what we're going to see is these teams are just not going to be competitive in the playoffs. And at some point, Big 12 SEC are just going to take everybody that matters and create their own league, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's going to happen is that they're just going to I think they're going to absorb everything that's left, and you're going to see the rest of college football fold. And remember, for the major media sources, they're probably pretty happy with that result, right? Because at the end of the day, they want the games they broadcast to have the best ratings. And if all the teams are in the same conference, then those games that ESPN's broadcasting have the best ratings. And they really don't care too much if the rest of the sport goes away. And in fact, I'd almost be curious for these sports networks if they're going to be too offended that no one has to carry, I don't know, Wake Forest do football. Like, do they really care if they may be pretty happy to get rid of that as dead weight They may not be making that much money on the broadcast and the overhead, and they may well be happy just to make that go away and only deal with the games they want to carry. And that's probably even more true with Fox and NBC and CBS, honestly, because of the NFL. They really don't need a huge slate of games. They just want a handful of games a week, and they want their games to be the ones that matter. So I do think that's going to drive these conferences to absorb everything that's left. And I really, truly believe there's a danger of a lot of the sport falling off. People would say, well, the bottom half of college football, FBS, is just going to split off and form its own division. What I don't think people realize is the monetary aspect of that those teams can't really afford to just split off and
Right.
no longer – they have a lot of money that they get because of TV contracts tied into the fact that they exist along with the realm of everybody else. But just like UAB folded briefly and came back, there are a lot of programs where if their athletic department was suddenly, they would lose $10-20 million a year in revenue by no longer being tied in the TV contracts that are associated with these other schools. The ADs would fold, or they would stop playing football. They wouldn't be able to afford it. So
I saw something, Josh, where Utah State got $1.9 million to play in Tuscaloosa today. $1.9 million. And these programs are already operating in the red. And you take away, because Utah State, I haven't looked at their schedule, but they're probably playing 2 or 3 of those type of games. If they get carved out and cut out, and these players are only looking forward to playing other G5 teams and not getting those paychecks because they're going to be playing in front of 27,000 people, they are going to fold. All of them won't, but it's going to be a much different landscape. And we're going to go from what those 130 teams that are there now to a division of 50 teams and then maybe 20 or 30 more other teams. And we're going to lose 30, 40 schools that have a football program. And people say, I don't think people understand when they say, oh, well, NAI can do it and Division III can do it. They don't have full scholarship rosters. Those teams have like 10 or 15 scholarship players. The rest of them are people that are paying. And if you look at NAI rosters, it's a lot of like rich kids like that they get. They're a money pot for these schools because they go recruit in high school and kind of let them, you can play out your college football dreams, but also you got to pay $70,000 a year to go here. That's what it is there. And I don't think people realize it.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a lot of other repercussions from that too, because they're smaller rosters. That means they don't support nearly as many sports in general. And, the big time programs with their 85 football players means they have 85 female players because you have to have 1-to-1 scholarships. That Title IX requires that legally. And yeah, you shrink the size of college football and you're going to shrink every other sport. And now it's literally thousands or tens of thousands of, for example, female scholarship athletes that will not get a scholarship. Like the repercussions of this are really significant. But I think let's keep it moving along now because I know looks like we've gotten a critical mass of Ohio State fans. I want to make sure we get to some more recaps and stuff like that.
We're so behind on Super Chat, guys. I'm so sorry. But we did get one from here it is. We got one from Mike Farino, said Knowles knows. Wide receivers not quite as plug and play as expected. JSN going down wasn't great, but they shaped up in the fourth quarter. And this is a good time, I think, to really review that game. And we'll cut it up for the people that didn't catch the live show. But Josh, what we said or what we thought was going to happen was that Notre Dame was going to be the kind of Notre Dame that they've been in the past that struggles with, an elite offense and is pretty sound defensively, but at some point the dam will break. I think that happened, just not to the extent that we expected. What also happened was really defensively, at least from what we see, Ohio State looked much improved. Now, I will say we don't know how good Notre Dame's offense is with a first time ever starting quarterback going into the shoe and their best player on the team last year, or at least offensively, their running back is no longer there. So we don't know how good they are offensively, but even still, I don't think I expected 10 points.
Yeah, no, I didn't either. It's really hard to evaluate because I certainly didn't expect them to be scoring 7 points in the first half either, right? So how do you kind of how do you take away both sides of it? But I'm trying to, if I can actually get it to load, I'm trying to pull up the box score right now so I can look at the final stats on it.
And all we do is look at box scores, guys. Like that's
true.
what I've constantly heard from people that talk about us is we just look at box scores. We don't watch games.
Yeah, we only look at box scores. I've actually never played a sport before.
I've never seen a sport played before. I just look at box scores.
Yeah, no, okay, I kind of got it up. It's weirdly broken right now. I mean, I think the biggest thing that happened in that game is really no one could move the ball on the ground until the very end. Ohio State really stopped Notre Dame's run game cold. That was something that kind of a concern we had because I'm really worried that I have the wrong name in my head, but it's Kyron Williams, right? Was the running back from last year. We were really high on him, and I wasn't quite sure how Notre Dame was going to make do without him. And they had supposedly a great offensive line, but maybe the biggest thing with Ohio State is they showed up at their front in a way that they didn't do last year. That was the big question mark for me. Didn't seem to be a problem. How much of that is Notre Dame? How much of it is the running backs? How much of it is the fact that Buchner didn't really scare anybody. He was 10 of 18. He only threw 18 passes the entire ball game. Now, he was 177 yards on 18 passes, which means he threw for almost 10 yards per attempt. It just didn't throw much.
54-yarder, and then it was dink and dunk city after that.
Right. And the point I'm making is they didn't Notre Dame definitely played that game conservative, undoubtedly knowing how low scoring it was. They didn't want their new quarterback to give the game away. And it did kind of play in Ohio State's hands, I think, a little bit because it made it a lot easier defensively. And then Ohio State was able to sort of wear down, and they had the most depth, and it showed at the end of the ball game. I have, despite the fact that they're only 10 points, despite the fact that they only allowed, what was it, about 250, 260 yards total in the game. I have a little bit of reservations. There were in several points where I saw the linebackers not quite reading things correctly. The long pass play and a couple other big pass plays in the game came from the fact that they had alignment issues in the secondary. I still thought there were a little signs that maybe they're not totally buttoned up. But again, the thing is they were sound on their fronts. They were physical at their fronts. They didn't get run over. And I think that last year's Ohio State team would have taken 76 yards rushing allowed versus a major opponent every day of the week. So I definitely think you got to give a lot of props to Knowles, but I think also it's just the roster is starting to look like they should have looked like given the talent level. And we're going to have to see probably a couple more games to see how much of that is Notre Dame. And especially remember, it's Notre Dame without Brian Kelly, with a new coaching staff. How much of a step back are they taking? How much of a step back do they have due to the quarterback situation? There's a lot of variables there. But even despite all that, you have to be very impressed with Ohio State's defensive performance, don't you?
I was impressed, but I'm still reserved. And this is something that, Ohio State fans don't want to hear this, but we've said this for a while. The thing that I've always wished I got to see more of, which is weird because it used to be the SEC's problem and now it's the Big Ten's problem, is teams that keep it close against Ohio State, but they're just so inept offensively that they can't take advantage of it. I think of Wisconsin in recent past, Northwestern in recent past, teams that they somehow find a way to slow down this Ohio State offense, but they also, are really kind of bland and they're never going to score more than 17 points against a good team anyway. And I think that's a little bit of what we got in Notre Dame tonight. And that's what I was saying earlier. Ohio State doesn't want to play Georgia in week 1. Ohio State in week 12 might be better than Georgia, might be better than Alabama. 2019, Ohio State at the end of that year was outstanding. It was a great football team. Ohio State now, and for whatever reason, that Oregon team that beat them last year wasn't great. And Ohio State probably beats them, in week 10. For whatever reason, they don't look great early in the year. They just happened to play a team, I think, tonight that had a first time ever starting quarterback and didn't have it offensively. The one thing I will take away from this, Josh, that I was really encouraged by if I'm an Ohio State fan, is you touched on it in passing in your open. That last drive where they needed to score and put it, make it a 2-score game, they were pulling guards. 79 was mashing people. They were pulling guards and running the ball. They're like, you know what? We've got all these great wide receivers. We got this Heisman Trophy candidate quarterback, but we're going to mash you. And they did it. And then they got down to the 2 and just Mind Williams just punched it in. That was really encouraging for me to see, because that level of physicality wasn't there last year against Michigan, wasn't there against Oregon. And that's something they need for when their passing game starts clicking, it'll already be there.
Yeah, it's interesting because from a game perspective, I think maybe it's a slight disappointment. It's kind of funny because, right, the line was 17, and I mean, Ohio State darn near covered, right? Like if they score in that last drive, or if they score there in the last few minutes, and there's real potential of it, I felt like going in the fourth quarter, they would have covered that game. There's so many different variables, right? You asked when we were doing the game preview, and somebody mentioned this, if it was an advantage to have a new coaching staff and a new quarterback, and I said, well, maybe, kind of. And I still don't think people process what I was saying there, which is I felt like maybe they'd get some random points on the board because of how new they were, and that might give them some ability to stay in the game. And quite frankly, I don't think I was wrong. Like Buchner's, like the running ability he had in the game was a huge reason why Notre Dame had a couple drives that they put together. And at times Ohio State was a little bit out of position, and that's the only way Notre Dame moved the ball. I think if they played this game again in 3 or 4 weeks when Ohio State is gotten a little more comfortable offensively, and especially when there's more tape on what Notre Dame looks like, I kind of have a feeling this game would end like 40-0. So I think the fact that this was week 1 and everything was so new was the only reason that Ohio State was down at the half. And I think if you played this game out another couple quarters, Ohio State would have just kept batting the lead. And so when I think about them from like a rankings perspective or a projection perspective, I don't really think of this game as them being 11 points better than Notre Dame. I think it's a lot more than that in terms of overall quality. I think it just took them a little bit of time to get there.
So Ohio State's got Arkansas State Toledo before they have a game against Wisconsin. It's at home. Ohio State doesn't have a road game until October 8th. That is kind of crazy. So I think that something we talked about with Georgia, in that they had a lot of new faces, but they didn't have a challenging schedule until the end of the year, is that like the one thing that might make them slip up is catching them early because they're new, but they don't have anybody that can challenge them. Ohio State's got a little bit of this too, where we said that stretch. Now, after seeing Iowa today, I don't care. I don't think it's a tough stretch, but like that Michigan State, Iowa, Penn State stretch could be tough. I think that having 2 weeks before Wisconsin where they're playing, tomato cans, and then getting Wisconsin at home, like I think that a lot of these things that we see that they need to work out, for whatever reason, Ohio State needs that at the beginning of the year. This is kind of just what the doctor ordered, right?
Yeah, I think so. And honestly, for Ohio State, I think it'd be better to be pushed a little bit more defensively, because it seems like the area going into the year they need to work on. It kind of feels like last year they came out of the gate trying to build an offense that was an all-timer and kind of forgot to have the defense sorted. And this year it felt like they came out of the gate where they'd focused so much on the defense that maybe they didn't get the offense really in sync in fall camp. But they're going to have plenty of time against what will be fairly quality opponents to sort of get their act together. And yeah, I think they're going to turn around. So, today's performance from Ohio State, quite frankly, I think this is an A- team overall. If you like their average quality compared nationally, for the performance of where they're at talent wise, I think it was a C- performance. Just being honest. I think you can give a lot of credit to the defense, and I do give credit to the defense. It's really hard with Notre Dame's offense being what it is. I didn't expect Notre Dame to score more than 17 points in this game to start with. Okay. Like I just wasn't expecting it when we were doing our previews. I thought maybe it would get a really high score. Maybe Notre Dame would score some points late, but I didn't really expect them to score a ton of points in meaningful competition. So yeah, I don't know, but we're definitely gonna see where they are.
Oh, we lost Josh again. That's all right. We got some super chats to go through. It's just going to be a weird cutoff when we do our cutout for the Ohio State review. KillTech9 says, best Saturday night recap show, TV or internet. Thank you so much. Just wish y'all could get Josh Pate or have him call in on the show. Josh and I texted this weekend, and Josh texted this weekend that there's Josh, other Josh, that we need to do that a collab. We've been talking for years, like Josh Pate and both of us we're really good friends with Josh Pate, and we've kind of just not had the time to get a collaboration going. We wanted to do something a little deeper on a collab than just like a preview of a game or something like that. And playoff expansion might be that topic that gets us to do some sort of collab with him. It hasn't been for any other reason than we just haven't had time. Dawson said Stetson looked great today. Maybe not a Heisman candidate, but not that game manager everybody wants to kind of box him in as. And look, we said this last year. We were out in front of it. We were team Stetson Bennett by like week 3. We said he was the starter, not because JT Daniels was injured, but because he was better and he fits better in this offense. Honestly, I think if he plays in game 1 instead of JT Daniels, it's not a 10-3 game against Clemson. But Herb Street said something this morning. I think he's right. He's Stetson Bennett. It's how he looks in his uniform. He doesn't look like somebody that's an imposing figure, that's some sort of baller, and that's why he won't win the Heisman. He probably won't get drafted high, but he'll make an NFL roster. He's got a good enough arm, and he can obviously execute an offense at a very high level. He understands it, and he's efficient. Josh, I could see him maybe never being an NFL starter, but holding a clipboard for 12 years.
Yeah, he's consistent. I mean, Georgia's offense, we talked about it in the preview, is just ultra efficient, just in an absurd degree of efficiency. And they were 3rd in the country last year in points per drive. And it's because Stetson Bennett is extremely consistent. He makes the right read most every time. He is an uncanny knack for escaping pressure out of the pocket, keeping drives alive. If you make him throw downfield and be an explosive downfield passing threat as a quarterback, he's not going to wow you. He's just not. He's not particularly consistent throwing the ball down the field in terms of accuracy. But if you keep the throws under 20 yards, he is extremely consistent in, his ability to just make the right decision, the right read, get the ball out quickly. And, that, to me, that's a big difference between where Ohio State is and Georgia is. If I want to segue from the prior conversation, and again, touching on something we talked about earlier with Stroud, I took some heat last year because I said early on that I didn't think Stroud was necessarily playing great quarterback play at the beginning of the year. And I think we saw it a little bit this year too, where if he's out of rhythm, he's not always very consistent. He's not always phenomenal at moving the chains. He does make some inaccurate throws. Now, Stroud has a much higher upside, right? Like as an NFL quarterback, he's much more capable of being a starter. He can hit throws downfield. He can thread the needle, but he's more likely to get out of rhythm and miss routine throws or crossing routes. Bennett is the exact opposite. The stuff that a lot of people miss on, you just take for granted that he's going to hit it. And like you said, as an NFL backup, you can plug him into a game and he'll dink and dunk a little bit and move the ball down the field if you have to for an injured guy. He's never going to be a starter, but he's somebody you can rely on to be, reasonably competent to move the ball a little bit and not just throw a game away if you have a lead. Stroud's somebody that can actually win you the game, but it's kind of interesting, I think, how much people take for granted the just sheer consistency you get from Bennett compared to just basically everybody else in college football. And this is probably a good point to mention. If you guys like the backdrop, I don't know, I'll probably end up on video some more. So I'm sort of trying to build out a studio, and I got all the stuff shipped in today. So I don't have anything behind me, but I did manage to get some lights and a tripod and get it plugged into my computer as it was shipped from Amazon, I think literally at 7 p.m. tonight. So this was as much as I could get done in that time span, but it's kind of fun to be in front of an actual camera.
Yeah, we've been trying to get Josh. So he's been on camera for the live shows, but we've been working and talking for years about getting him on camera for our actual previews. Somebody will ask, so I'll let you know. Right now, I just switched over to Rare Breed, and yes, there is one ice cube in it. It's 116 proof, so leave me alone. I can put one ice cube in it. I will say I gave a friend of mine up north a really nice bottle of brown party liquor a couple of years ago or last year, and he celebrated New Year's with it, and he sent me a picture, and his glass was full of ice, and I wanted to die because I know how slow he drinks. So at the end of that, it was just water. So, okay, Josh, I think that we haven't touched on Michigan much today. I don't want to talk too much about that. They played a really bad team who not only was a bad team, but also a personnel, just terrible matchup for them. I don't think we learned much from that. There's a lot of Michigan fans in the chat giving Ohio State fans hell. I do think that Michigan probably beats Ohio State if they played today, but they don't play that game till the end of the year. Ohio State was playing Notre Dame out of conference, which Michigan used to do, but they don't do that anymore. Okay, Josh. So tell me, like, based on what you saw today, and we still got the Florida State and LSU game tomorrow and Clemson, Georgia Tech later on, but you've seen enough. I feel like we're finally, like, because I don't feel like we were last year. I feel like we've finally gotten out of the COVID year sort of fog of teams not being great or not being really good. And the defenses feel like they have certainly regulated a little bit. That was my big takeaway from this whole week and a little bit last week. Do you feel that way too a little bit?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're starting to see football get a little more normal. Certainly defenses look a lot more competent, right? Coming out of COVID, and COVID had a weird thing because people weren't really allowed to practice as a full team and they kept people isolated, and defenses are reactive. So if you don't let a defense scrimmage against an offense, they're not going to be very good. It's certainly 2020 defenses were terrible. And I think it even bled into 2021. I think some of it was just the lack of practice in 2020 and how bad they were meant it took a couple years to catch up. It feels like football's gotten a lot better. It's gotten a lot more competent. And really high level football is not 50-50 games, right? I think if you watch the NFL, sometimes you have quarterbacks that go off, same thing in college, but by and large, you want to be seeing scores somewhere around the 30s in a really hyper competitive ball game. And we're seeing that a lot more often. So it is, yeah, I totally agree with you. I think football's gotten a lot better.
So I don't know what to think about, like, somebody mentioned hopefully Clemson hammers Georgia Tech. Like, we're not even talking about Clemson right now. And it's very possible that they could be the Clemson of old if they can get some production at quarterback, or the not old, but recent past. What do we do then? Like, if Clemson shows that they're an elite team, like, then I think that there's room in the playoff party for 4 legitimate teams. But that's, if I'm thinking of, like, right now, it's clearly Alabama and Georgia. Like you said, Ohio State looks like an A- team that had a not great performance today and can get better over the course of the year. Michigan is probably right there with them. There's room for them to move up to that level, Alabama and Georgia. Clemson is the only other team in my mind, based on what I've seen so far this year, that I would even consider in that realm. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I haven't seen Clemson play, but
I'm just talking about in terms of roster and what we know about the teams. Like, I've seen enough to know that, I know it's week 1, but, like, who else would we think? Like Texas A&M, maybe, if some of those freshmen show up. But based on what I saw today, no. Like, if I'm thinking end of the year already, because I want to ruin everybody's season in week 1, right now, the only one I can imagine that could be on the level of those teams is Clemson.
Yeah, Texas A&M has the overall talent to be at that level. And you see it defensively, they look great. But offensively, yeah, the game of football is, let's say, 40% quarterback, 60% overall talent. That's how Clemson won their original, first few national titles over Alabama in the recent playoff era. Texas A&M, it looks way behind at quarterback, but yeah, those 3 teams seem the most on point. And I pulled up something. 247 Sports finally fixed their college football team composite, which makes me happy. For a while, they had a lot of errors. The biggest one is I would always check Alabama because they're the first one on the list. And Jordan Battle, the starting safety, was listed as a 0-star. So every time you looked at the college football composite, that was true for about every team. I would just go back and check that one thing, and I would confirm, yeah, they haven't fixed it. It didn't actually represent the regular rosters. Well, they did. So I can tell you right now, the gap from Alabama to Clemson in that system is about 70 points. It's 1,016 versus 943. Okay, so 70 out of 1,000. So that's about a 70-point gap there. The jump from Clemson to the next one, which is actually Texas, is about 50 points. Oregon's the next team, and they're 70 points down from Clemson. So the point being, Alabama to Clemson, and that's Alabama, Georgia at 989, Ohio State right behind Georgia at 983, A&M is at 946, Clemson's at 943. Those 5 teams are in this like 70-point clump. And once you go from them, you immediately drop 70 points. And everybody else is about 150 points behind them. I mean, by the time you get to Notre Dame, for example, they're in 866 in the ranking, 120 points behind Ohio State. Double, the gap between Alabama and Ohio State is a quarter the gap between Ohio State and the 10th best team in Notre Dame. So, yeah, it isn't surprising is the point I'm making that it's Clemson. I just wanted to put some numbers behind it. Those teams are kind of operating in their own sphere from a talent perspective. And absent Heisman level QB play, quite frankly, I'm not sure anybody else can really get into that sphere.
Everybody's talking in the chat about how big of a loss it was for JSN when he went down for Ohio State. And, Georgia fans spent the offseason sort of mocking the fact that Bama lost 2 wide receivers in the last, 2 weeks of the season, or one last game of the season in the SEC championship game, and then lost one in the national championship game. But isn't it pretty, like, we talk a lot about how returning wide receiver talent and returning DB talent is a huge indicator of how good you're going to be, at least in terms of the rhythm of your offense or your defense's ability to not give up a massive bust and a touchdown. So if you think about, I think it's a fair point, and I want to give a little color to that or some time to that, because they were replacing 2 really good receivers from last year's team, which kind of allowed JSN to be that third guy, even though he put up a lot of stats. But when you shift those 2 guys out and move basically everybody into a new elevated role, and then one of those goes down immediately, I think in the first half of this game, that can throw your offense really out of whack, especially that timing, right?
Definitely. I mean, it's one of those things where I say it's a reason, not an excuse, right? When Alabama lost receivers, well, depth is a part of the game. Frankly, the same thing's true of Ohio State. There's we keep hearing how they have the best, deepest wide receiver in core of college football. You can't make that statement at the same time, use it as an excuse, but it is a reason, right? Like, I understand that they're going to be a better offense with Smith and Jigba than they were without him when I think forward. And I think because of how the RPO works, and I've talked about this a lot, right? It breaks the way safeties make keys. And so safeties don't really play over the top the way they used to. They kind of have to float around a little bit more and play sort of a center field robber role half the time. They can't bracket coverage as readily as they used to. And it means having a wide receiver that can win one-on-ones is basically a cheat code in college football today. And if you have a high-level quarterback and one of those receivers, you can kind of name your score most of the time. If you have 2 receivers, you can name your score every time. So, yeah, it's a big deal when one of them goes down. And, the difference between having 2 of them and one of them is a big jump, and having 1 to none is a massive jump. So it did matter. It does matter a lot. But, I think Ohio State had a lot of guys that showed up and played really well. But you could tell, I think it was less that they weren't as good in a lot of ways and more just that they weren't used to the roles they were being asked to play in. And you could tell the timing was off. And sometimes you don't know if, like, Stroud threw behind his guy, I forget, it was like number 2 on a crossing route, right? Is he throwing behind him, or is the receiver supposed to settle in his zone? And you don't really know as a fan. And even the commentators will guess at it, but none of us really know exactly the way they've schemed it. But I can guarantee you, if they had Smith and Jigma on the field and they had everybody else in the role they're used to having, it'd be a lot more likely for Stroud and the receiver to be on the same page. So it all kind of coalesces, right?
Yeah, and everybody, there's a couple of people in the comments that are like, "Oh, Ohio State has their 5-star city, so just put another 5-star in there." I can't believe you're complaining about one guy going down. But like, the star ranking doesn't matter. If you're a 5-star that's not getting reps because you're playing behind somebody else, and in practice they're getting all the reps, timing with your quarterback and understanding what you're supposed to do in certain situations, and whether or not you're running an option route, or if you're just like little bitty keys, those things take a lot of mental repetition. It doesn't matter how many stars you have. Last year, Mechie went down for Alabama, and you talk about roles, like that changed the role that Jameson Williams had to play. And we saw tonight and over the weekend, like, was it Trayshawn Holden, like number 11, I think it is. He's the guy that filled in for him, and he's probably more talented than Mechie, but Mechie was the guy in that role. So when he went down, it kind of broke the offense for a little bit until Jameson Williams could figure it out. Same thing with Ohio State. Like, this is JSN as the wide receiver 1 is the third guy from last year. And then he goes down. So your number 1 is the 4th guy from last year. Might be super talented, but like and this is how we see teams that are like super senior heavy beat 5-star city. LSU lost a lot of games last year to teams way less talented than them on paper. So experience and practice and having that rhythm means a lot.
Yeah.
Ryan Day's getting a lot of credit.
Add.
Ryan Day's getting a lot of, not credit, but a lot of frustration from Ohio State fans for not running the damn ball. What do you think about that?
I don't know that I agree with it. I mean, they had good rushing averages, and it was kind of from a couple big chunk plays. I felt like they were at a point where they were being just successful enough from using the run game as a change of pace for it to stay effective. The way Notre Dame was playing was really asking Ohio State to throw a lot of times. And so I think if they leaned on the run and as soon as that got in any way predictable, I think it would have struggled. It was interesting to me that while Henderson was effective in a lot of ways, I thought Mayan Williams was more effective as a power back, which I'm not sure what that says about that game. I haven't really processed that yet, but.
If you remember last year, I keep having to mute because I'm coughing a lot. If you remember last year, we were really high on Mayan Williams coming into the season. And they had, it's tough when you have a really electric back and then you have a kind of a power plotting back. You want the electric back because he can break off a 69-yarder. But at sometimes, especially against physical teams, being able to get 4 yards, even though he's never going to break that big one, means a lot. So let's shift gears a little bit and tell me, like, give me maybe a pleasant surprise from the earlier games today that you didn't expect. And I know that you didn't expect this question to come, so I'll give you a little bit of time to think about it. But like, from the early games today, or maybe even the games you saw yesterday, or even week 0, give me a pleasant surprise that maybe people aren't thinking about.
That's an interesting one. And there's a lot of, I think the answer to that is probably going to come from one of the duds. So I'm trying to scroll down. I have a couple of mine. One, Michigan. I think Michigan would be my biggest surprise. Now, Colorado State, as you know, was a 3-9 team last year. I know we got a lot of Ohio State fans in the chat, but you got to give credit for them. They played really well, and they dominated that game on both sides of the ball. They looked a lot more competent offensively. I didn't think McNamara looked great. I kind of think they're going to end up going with the other guy, but I thought they played really good. And, I texted you this. I'm going to put it on the record now before we do our top 10, maybe sort of leading in a segue. Right now, in my view, Michigan is a better version of Texas A&M. I mean, disagree or disagree with that?
Well, you said, so you kind of stole my thing, because you sent me a note that said Michigan is better than Texas A&M, and I said Michigan is a better version of Texas A&M. So obviously I agree, since I said it first.
Well, I have to steal your thing sometimes. I'm not claiming that every other clever thing you said was mine. I always say that all the clever tweets are my tweets, and then all the other tweets, those are Daniel's. just to make sure everybody
all the
understands.
food tweets, by the way, anything food related. Like last year, I asked, and I'll ask the chat now, what fast food restaurant has the best fries that hold up the longest? Those types of questions. The post today with the pork butt that I cooked, and y'all, I had a 5-hour stall. 5 hours, never happened to me. Those are all my posts. All the nerdy number posts that are actually more interesting. Those all come from Josh.
Interesting is a strong word.
Okay, so we probably should try to do a top 10. And if you want to talk for like 3 minutes, I'll have mine.
Yeah, sure. I've got to actually write mine out too. I think my biggest takeaway from today is a lot of teams were kind of who we thought they were. The one exception was Ohio State. I think if JSN doesn't go down injured, we're right, and Ohio State covers. So it's funny. People talk about picking against the spread and if we're so good, why don't we quit? You're never going to pick against the spread in anything more than about a 60% clip, even if you're almost like omniscient, because guys go down injured and things happen. And a lot of the spreads are really actually set pretty much exactly where the difference between the two teams are. So it's just a couple random plays that decide the game. And that's why it's fun to watch. It is interesting to me that it doesn't feel like football is as explosive as it has been between high-level teams. It feels like defense maybe is taking more of a step forward. There was a theory about that last year after a number of years of really, really high-level offense. I wasn't sure that I bought it. I thought maybe it had a lot to do with quarterback play. Maybe that's coming around. Maybe it is defense that's actually taking a step forward. And quite frankly, I think it's a good thing. To buy Daniel a second more time, I'll get on one of the points I've often made. They've done some studies. I think it was a Harvard study that was trying to figure out why soccer is so popular globally. And I am not a soccer fan. In fact, I'm really a college football fan more than almost anything else combined. The reason, though, that it came across with soccer is that it's about suspense. It's about tension. In soccer, you don't score a lot of points, but there's a lot of waiting for that moment. There's a lot of watching the ball slowly make its way across the field, and you feel like you're just on the cusp of scoring, and then it doesn't happen, right? And it's the suspense. It's like a horror movie where you think the guy's going to jump out from behind the door, and then nope, it's just an innocuous door. And then when you don't expect it, it hits. And defense is important to college football because it adds suspense. If somebody's scoring every drive, yeah, it's fun and people love it, and those games are wild, but it's one of those things. It's like eating a lot of candy, right? I sound like Josh Pate right now, but right, like everybody loves going to Halloween and eating candy, and the first couple pieces are fun and it's fun to gouge. But once you've done it for about an hour, you just feel sick to your stomach, and the next day you don't want to look at that candy bag. So some things are best enjoyed in moderation, and I think scoring is one of them. And college football as a sport is just more fun when defense is better. And personally, I am really hopeful that defense has caught up a little bit. Now, scoring across the board, I was looking at it like last year, even with it having caught up, it was still about 2 points a game higher than it was 10 years ago. It had been 3 points a game higher. So basically, if you want to think of it this way, the difference from where it had been to where it is cut maybe a third to a half, right? It's still more offensively oriented, but maybe not quite as extreme, maybe a little bit less extreme. So that's my biggest takeaway. The Ohio State Notre Dame game, I think, maybe somewhat a reflection of the fact that a 24-10 win over a quality opponent is actually a quality win now, and you can't necessarily expect to score 40 points against everyone. Like we've been preaching for a few years, that statement may actually be starting to go away, and I'll be interested to see if it is.
All right. I'm going to try to run through a top 10 that makes sense. Right now it's week 2 and it doesn't make sense. And this is with the caveat that LSU and Florida State haven't played yet. Clemson and Georgia Tech haven't played yet. So if either of those 2 games give us information that messes this up, then so what? It's Saturday night and it's late. So number 1, I've got Georgia, and there's going to be some people mad about this because in their mind, Alabama's number 1. Alabama won 55-0. Alabama shouldn't drop. But Alabama's number 1 coming out of August, where we had no information. Everything is hypothetical. Oregon was also number 11 on that list, and Oregon is nowhere near the 11th best team in the country. I will say this, Josh, if Alabama goes on the road and handles their business against a Texas team that I expect to be improved this year, I'm probably going to move Alabama back up to number 1 because I really do think that Oregon is terrible, but I also think Georgia is that good. I've got Bama at number 2. These are 1A, 1B for me right now. The one thing I will say, so Alabama's defense, I think, may be one of the best Saban's ever had. At least I know I saw something the other day that said they're the most senior laden, the most experienced defense he's ever had. They have the potential to be amazing. They're really good in the secondary. They've finally got a decent linebacker core. They've had some issues there for a while. So I think the defense is better than it's been in a while. And the wide receivers didn't take a step back like I thought that they might. But Bryce Young looked a little shaky in the red zone tonight, based on what I saw. So that's why I've got them at number 2. I've got Ohio State number 3. I still think, like you, I think it's what you said was perfect. A- team, C+ performance. I don't think Notre Dame is terrible. Actually, I moved them into my top 10. I don't think they're a terrible team, though. So I think they're actually better than maybe we had anticipated coming into this season. So I'm okay with Ohio State number 3. Clemson at number 4 is more of a potential pick than anything else. Clemson might suck this year. They could be a 5-loss team because they almost were last year, and I'm glad to move them out if they prove me wrong there. Michigan number 5. Michigan handled their business today. So it's one of those things where I think I had them at 5 last week. They're not going to move up. They're not going to move down. Nothing about them gave me new information because they were playing Colorado State. I need to see them play somebody, and unfortunately, I don't think they play anybody for a month. I've got USC at number 6. They played Rice today. It's hard to know, and I think it was like 66-14 or something. But I noticed that Addison wasn't the top receiver. Williams ran the ball a good bit. It seemed like they were comfortable with Lincoln Riley, and they didn't do the like new coach, new regime, ugly, start out of the gate thing. So got a decently talented roster, and I think they're going to win a lot of games in the Pac-12. If I had to pick them playing Utah today, I'd probably pick USC. Oklahoma number 7. They also handled their business today. I'm a little concerned that they don't have a lot of depth, and the season might take its toll on them. Florida number 8. And look, I think that when things shake out based on how people normally rank, meaning if you have losses, you drop. If you win, you go up. Florida's going to end up 15-20. I think they're a decent team, a good team that's got a tough schedule, and it's going to take its toll on their win-loss record. But to me, that doesn't mean they're not the 8th best team in the country, 9th best team in the country. Right now, if you don't have to get into their depth, Florida is really good. My concern is at quarterback. I like Anthony Richardson as a runner. I still don't know that he's comfortable running an actual offense yet. He might be another year away. Notre Dame number 9. And look, this is a situation people get mad at us all the time. I will move you up if you lose a game. All the people that are going to be mad about us having Notre Dame ranked where we have them, because you might have them too, need to explain then where they have Ohio State. Because if you have Ohio State in the top 5 right now, and Notre Dame went in there and played blow for blow with them for 3.5 quarters on the road, then you can't tell me Notre Dame isn't a top 10 team. And right now, if you're looking at the field, who else are you going to put in there? NC State, they almost lost to ECU. Like, there's a lot of teams out there. North Carolina's 2-0, but by the skin of their teeth. I don't know who else you put up there. I moved out Oklahoma State. Scored a ton of points. They were in my top 10 last week, 58 points. Spencer Sanders looked amazing. He's, I think, coming into his own, but they gave up 44 to Central Michigan. And look, a lot of that was garbage time points, but that speaks to depth. And number 10, I'm replacing Oklahoma State with a Baylor team that I know nothing about, but I know they're well coached, and I think that we're going to have another top 10 team from the Big 12. And if it's not Oklahoma State, then it's going to be Baylor. I think it's going to be between those two teams for that other spot. That's my top 10, Josh. I'll shut up. I'll go on mute, have a sip of my drink, and let you run with it.
My top 10 in a lot of ways isn't going to look too different and not a huge shift from last week. My number 1 is still Alabama. Defensively, they didn't really allow anything, at least the early part of the game, which is probably the only time the starters played that I saw. Their defense looked absolutely dominant, a lot more consistent than we have seen. And Utah State is obviously a G5 team that isn't going to be the same sort of threat as Oregon, but they're not a bad G5 team. They're actually quite a good one. And they did sort of play around with them the way you would expect a number one team to play. So I have no reason to drop them. Point being, number two is Georgia. Clearly cemented themselves as either being number two or number one. I am still not 100% sold on Oregon, given kind of how things played out relative to what I researched on them. I'm kind of worried that things I saw as strengths had more to do with the other side of the ball being a weakness in like their spring game. We'll see. For example, the DBs struggled a lot in the spring game. I thought the receivers were playing well. I think it may be that the receivers are more average than I realized, and the DBs or the back seven is really bad. We'll have to find out. That's the difficulty of ranking week one. But certainly there was nothing to criticize from Georgia, and they played with them like they were air. So it was a dominant performance. Georgia's number two. I keep Ohio State at number three. I don't think putting away Notre Dame 24-10 was anything to be ashamed of. I think Notre Dame more than likely, and then I'll go ahead and sort of tease, they're not going to make my top 10, but they would make my top 15. I think they're right on the cusp of that, which is where I had them preseason. I don't think they're number 5, number 6 team. I haven't really understood why they were ranked that high, given where the roster's at. You can see that they have good pieces. You can see they have a good defense. They just don't have a lot of explosion offensively, and that was really apparent. My number 4 team is Michigan. I thought they were extremely impressive. When they had their starters in the game, Colorado State could not block them. And the biggest concern was that they lose Hutchinson, and then maybe they take this step back from the front seven being less disruptive. And what I saw was absolutely no indication of that. I saw a team that looks like they're going to be as not only aggressive, but as effective in their aggressiveness as they were last year. And have every reason to think their offense could be as good or better than they were last year. So I have Michigan number 4. Number 5 is Clemson. We haven't seen Clemson play, so we'll see what they look like against Georgia Tech. Now, Georgia Tech still in complete, utter overhaul mode from the triple option. Don't know if it's going to be a contest. So it'll take a while to see. But even last year against teams like Georgia Tech, the offense looked inept. I think the defense is going to be phenomenal. I just want to see if the offense is actually going to be merely good. And if they are average to good, this is a top 4 team at Clemson. They would probably pass Michigan even. The potential for defense on that team is so good and so high. But I need to see something out of the offense. Next up for me, number 6 is Oklahoma. Oklahoma took care of business. They looked a lot. There's only so much you can take away from that game, but they were dominant. It looks offensively like they've kind of gotten all their stuff together. Gabriel was very effective. Not much more to say at this point. We're recording this Saturday night. I didn't get the chance to watch that game in detail, but I did flip through and sort of keep an eye on it. Baylor is my next at number 7. Now, Baylor didn't have a quality opponent, so they're just sort of staying pat where they were from last week. I'm going to keep them in that slot, sort of sitting there with Florida. And this is, I'll go ahead and tell you, for me, it's Baylor at 7, Florida at 8, USC at 9, Utah at 10. And this group, really Oklahoma down to Utah, it starts to get into the mash of teams that I have a really hard time sorting out. We often talk about the fact that if you play a really close game, I'm not going to really punish you a ton. That's why Utah for me is sitting at number 10. Baylor, I assume, is probably better than Oklahoma State, probably similar to Oklahoma, so I'm close to Oklahoma. Haven't seen enough to move them down any further. Florida showed why I had them a top 10 team, because I had a lot of belief in that roster. Anthony Richardson, I thought in the spring game, looked tremendously better than the guy that I was very critical of early last year. I know people say that they made a mistake by not starting him all last year. I disagree. He was not comfortable in Mullen's offense, and you can't just like magically snap your fingers and make that go away. He didn't make good reads. He didn't make good decisions. He didn't understand the offense. And what I saw in the spring game was an offensive scheme that was much better suited for him, and 2, a player that much better understood that scheme. That showed up today. And he knows where his strengths are, and the coaching staff plays to his strengths enough to be successful. And defensively, they're just a lot better. USC, I have them number 9. Again, it's hard to take away much of anything from Rice, but the defense looked pretty darn good. Rice is a horrible team, but their defense looked terrible last year, so any sort of a good performance is good. They did give up a lot on the ground, but at least the secondary was very active. Offensively, they look like they're going to be an explosive Lincoln Riley team. We'll see how that plays out. And number 10 for me is Utah. In our preview, and there's some, I think most people agreed with it, but there were some people that scoffed at this idea that we said, look, Utah hasn't played in Oregon at Eugene since 2017. And there really isn't any other environment, I think, in the Pac-12 that could remotely compare to playing in the swamp. I think it did affect Utah. There were several times they had false starts or formational penalties or delay of games that were probably largely due to crowd noise.
And they
I
also
think if
throw
you
a stressful interception at the end of the game.
right, I think if Utah played that game at Utah, I think they probably win. So I'm going to put Florida ahead because they did win head to head. So I'm going to, with the way I always evaluate it, I always say, if I played your schedule and you played mine, what would your outcome look like and what would mine look like? That's how I do it, right? So it's wins and losses matter. If you lose a game, I'm going to assume you lose it every time. But I'm going to compare it and say, okay, you lost 3 games in the SEC. One of them was a stupid loss to Mississippi State. If I took USC and made them play that schedule, how would it turn out, right? And if they're if they're having stupid losses to Cal, I'm going to think they're going to lose to Mississippi State and somebody else. So with Utah, I give Florida credit for the win, but I also really give a lot of edge to the fact that, hey, I think this game came down to who had home field advantage. And I think Utah's a very closely paired team. So for me, with week 1, really having barely more information we had last week because so many teams played an FCS opponent or somebody that was greatly overmatched. That's where my top 10 is. It looks a lot like it did last week. And honestly, I feel pretty pleased with it because my top 10 does look a lot like it did last week. So I don't know if that says something more about the games that were played or more about the fact that a lot of teams kind of are who we thought they were. And for me to have Florida in the top 10, I think was, if I get one kudos from week 0, I think that one's it.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people are going to, a lot of people killed us for not having Utah in our top 10 and killed us for having Florida in our top 10. But those same people weren't taking the 3 points. If they're so far apart, then why was it Utah only a 3-point favorite? There's a few games we need to talk about, Josh, that we haven't talked about yet. Arkansas, Cincinnati. That was an ugly game. And, I looked at Arkansas's roster and their depth chart the other day with all that they had and the key transfers that they had. And I felt like they should handle this game better than they did, honestly. Cincy's starting a lot of new faces. It's a G5 program that didn't do that well in the transfer portal, doesn't do that well recruiting. I was a little disappointed in KJ Jefferson. I thought he was sluggish. I don't think that somebody said in the chat that he's a poor man Anthony Richardson. I think that's probably poor man's Anthony Richardson. I think it's a pretty good of him. Did you take away from this, because there's a lot of hype in Arkansas that maybe they were a little overhyped in the offseason?
I did, but I already felt that way. I mean, I didn't. We had some people in comments when we had our week 0 top 10 ask why I didn't have Arkansas or didn't talk about them. Honestly, when I look at the roster, I didn't consider them for my top 10. I think they have some good pieces. I think there's someone good enough to beat a good team in the SEC, but they've got a lot of holes too. I think they're something people forget is they were barely an average defense by SEC standards last year statistically. I don't expect the defense probably to be quite as good as they were last year, and they had transfers that sort of shored it up, and not all those guys are back. And so it was kind of interesting to see the Cincinnati game where Bumper Pool was all over the field and was really blowing up stuff left and right. And quite frankly, I've watched Bumper Pool play for years. It's kind of hard to forget that name and not notice him. And he is a good, sound ball player, but he's not a great athlete. And a lot of other teams have been able to expose him as a linebacker because he struggles in coverage and some other things. And Cincinnati couldn't really do it. But despite that, I really was kind of surprised that Arkansas's offense, which had a chance to be about as explosive as it was last year, didn't take a step forward. And I get they lose Treylon Burks, but they still got a lot of other pieces. They got Hazelwood as a transfer, who was a 5-star receiver and came over, had a long career, a lot of different places, touching base in Oklahoma and whatnot. But there's reasons to be optimistic about that. And I thought they were just kind of clunky. So, yeah, I'm with you. And Cincinnati, look, it's not a dig on Cincinnati as a program. It's just when you're built the way they are and you recruit the way they do, it's developmental. And you're going to be a really good team about every second or third year. And when you lose the big crop of talent like they did last year when they lost a lot of NFL talent off a G5 program, there's always going to be kind of a reset. And I didn't feel like Arkansas could take advantage of it. So I agree with you. I thought it was a little bit of an ugly game. Arkansas, frankly, looked a lot like I thought they would, which is I don't think they're going to be quite as good as they were last year. I still think they're solid. I think they're more than capable of beating someone, but I do think they're sort of overhyped from people that view them as a dark horse.
Another team we got to talk about is Penn State. Josh, you and I agree here, and I'm going to upset maybe our only Penn State fan in the chat, Steven. I don't like where they're at quarterback right now. I mean, you know what you're going to get. You got a 19-year senior coming in and being that guy, and everybody was raving about the last touchdown drive or whatever. Gus Johnson said it's the greatest quarterback, final drive he's ever seen. The guy threw in the flats, like in the long pass was like the guy was wide open. So like there was a 12-yard cushion and a bail technique, and he missed the tackle after the catch, and he went for 30 yards. I was not impressed at all. And then the only time I was impressed at quarterback is when Drew Aller came in, and I thought he looked good. And I think that here's the thing. You might go 7-5 with him, but you also might go 10-2. You're absolutely going to go 8-4 with Clifford at quarterback. What do you think?
Yeah, I was not enthused by Penn State. I felt like you saw a lot of the same warts defensively that you saw last year. I mean, they played pretty well defensively, don't get me wrong, but they definitely didn't play perfectly. And then offensively, there's nobody on that team that's a Dotson. And Washington was a guy that when we were talking about Dotson in the past, they've said, oh, we've got other players. We're more than just Dotson. We've got Washington. Washington is a pretty good slot player returner. And he's a good player if you want to go 8-4. If you want to go 10-2, if you want to go 11-1, he's not a number one receiver, in my view. I'm sorry, he's just not. And him and was it Ortega-Whiteside, right? Like guys have been around forever. I just don't see a great roster of players. And it's kind of amazing to me, given that they've elevated the recruiting, that when I watch them, there's not a lot that just pops. Like I hate to call them boring, but the roster kind of feels boring. And even when the coaching staff tries to be more aggressive or modern in their approaches, I think the roster sort of lets them down. And I'm not sure if that's an evaluation problem, a development problem, an issue with the scheme not properly utilizing the players, but it just doesn't ever seem to quite click. I will agree with you, though, and this is something I've said for years. I'm not particularly high on Sean Clifford. I think, yeah, he's got a big arm, and when you see a guy like that and he makes highlight throws, he can make any throw on the field, but he can also miss any throw on the field, and he can make some misses that are really, really damaging. So I agree with you. I'm still feel pretty mooted on my opinion on Penn State for sure.
Yeah, and there was a pretty good commentary on Clifford and in general that I thought was so pointed and clear that I'd never really thought about before. He said, there's this strained relationship between very senior, very experienced quarterbacks and the fan base, because you're good enough to start, but not good enough to have left. That is so, like, in this modern era of how valued quarterbacks are and how much they get paid, honestly, and get overdrafted like crazy. You couldn't find a year in your 4 or 5 year career that was soft at quarterback enough to get drafted in the second round and make some money. but you're still starting, that strains the relationship with a fan base because there's nothing to get excited for. I saw the most exciting thing I've seen offensively from Penn State in 3 years was a dropped pass because Aller put that ball like it was a boundary throw to I think a tight end. Steven helped me out, or maybe Josh if you saw it. It was beautiful and effortless and amazing, and it was a perfect read, and it wasn't like clunky and kind of fussing around in the pocket. He just saw it, read it, and did it. That's what Penn State needs. And honestly, you're right. The roster is kind of underwhelming. I think the coaches are doing a good job getting what they can out of the roster. But, you know, Noah Cain was a big deal there last year. And you even said, like, he might be just a dude in the SEC. He's not the dude in the SEC at running back. He's a dude. And that shouldn't be at Penn State.
No, I don't have much more to add to that. I mean, we only saw Aller throw a handful of passes. And look, I'm sure the problem with Aller is that he doesn't know the playbook. We go over this a lot. Same kind of conversation we had with Richardson. It doesn't matter how good a player you are. If you literally don't know how to call the play and which guy to look at to throw to, you can't run the play, right? So the plays that he knows how to run, he did a good job with. And maybe those were a set of one of 15 plays that he could run to execution. But it definitely feels like with this roster, this set of backs, this set of receivers. Now it's Lambert Smith, not our Take a Whiteside. There's way too many players in football. It just feels like there's a ceiling.
People are saying,
I will say it's midnight, by the way, so I'm going to turn into a pumpkin before too long. But.
Yeah, I got about 5 minutes left in my gas tank. People are saying that now Penn State's going to lose to Auburn. I don't know if people realize how bad Auburn is at quarterback. I just don't. I think Ashford's going to be starting by week 6, if not week 4. TJ Finley's not good, and you talk about a depleted roster. That's a depleted roster. Now Auburn's a really tough place to play. I think Jordan Hare's only like 87,000, so it's not the 103 or whatever you get in Bryant-Denny or in Neyland Stadium, but it's loud and it's a tough place to get a win. That roster is tough. That's going to be a game of two pretty mediocre teams, in my opinion. And I think whoever wins that game, because they'll probably both be undefeated, I think based on their early season schedule, whoever wins that game is going to be way overvalued. Don't you think?
Yeah. Well, that was what we talked about last year. And caught hell for it, right? And I will say we had some viewers that are more like loyal watchers, and a lot of them, like Steven, that are in this chat that understood what we were getting at or understood the fact that we were trying to be fair with it. That last year was saying, look, what was it? One of them, was it Penn State or Auburn? One of them was like top 5 when they came into that game.
Yeah, Penn State. Because remember, they beat Iowa after Iowa's quarterback got hurt. So they were they were number 4 in the country at one point last year.
And our point was, look, this game's not going to be a huge deal. Like, we didn't think Auburn was a great team, and we kept telling them, look, if you beat Auburn close, it's going to be a kind of a bad sign to us. And you should beat Auburn by a lot if you want to cling to be a top 5 team. And they did end up beating Auburn very close. And then as it turned out, Penn State was a solid team, but not a lot more than that last year. We weren't wrong at all, and we weren't unfair in that analysis. I might drop it a step. Would you agree with this, Daniel? And the Auburn Mercer game is one of my lists that I want to kind of break down a little more. It's difficult. I have to rewatch all those games, especially when you're playing in FCS, to take anything from it. Quick aside, I put that again with the thing with the short with King, right? There's a play where you see him throw it. They make a throw and catch for 30 yards where the guy goes over a DB, and you think it's a great play. And then when you go back and rewatch it, you go, well, actually, this was only contested because he completely misread coverage and threw to the wrong guy. And that's an interception in a normal game. Same thing's going to happen with Mercer. But I personally do expect that Auburn is probably going to take a step back from where they were last year, which means Penn State hopefully we'll do pretty well against Auburn. And whoever, if that's a close game, that's a bad sign for both sides. I mean, are you on the same page with me there?
Yeah, Penn State last year at home beat Auburn. Auburn tried a trick play, didn't work. Penn State scored off of it, beat them by that one score. I think they had a goal line stand late in the game. That was with Bo Nix. Bo Nix later got hurt and ultimately left for Oregon. TJ Finley, he ain't it. I mean, he's been around for a while. I think I was looking at some tape the other day of him playing in 2019 for LSU. Like you're gonna get, just like with Clifford. What you see so far is what you're gonna get, and that's it. So somebody noted, curse. They don't know if we should. Carl says, "I'm not sure if I should curse you or thank you for mentioning the most electric moment in college football video." There is a video from, I think, Harris Highlights called the most electric moment in college football. I don't know that it is the most electric moment, but it is crazy because we've been on this whole Beaver Stadium like whiteout situation for about 6 years now. People in the SEC don't realize how crazy that situation is. That video sort of encapsulates perfectly what it is, because it's before the first play of the game. Like it's the opening kickoff or whatever, and the stadium is just bonkers, and it's like the perfect summary of like the best parts of college football. Everybody should check that out. All right, Josh, one more maybe talking point. Let's talk about one more thing. Who's a team, because we love to go negative for the people that stay with us, who's a team that people are going to be too high on after week one, based on kind of what you've seen, kind of how you feel that the media is going to go?
You love throwing these really hard questions at me without me having thought about it. That's an interesting question. A team that people are going to be too high on after week one. Do you have any? Let me stall. Do you have an answer to that question? I'll let you go first and see if I can think up an answer.
I think that people might be too high on Florida. And I say this based on we've both got Florida in our top 10, but we rank differently than people rank, because people rank how clean is your win-loss record. I think that Florida might be the 8th to 15th best team in the country. What that means is really they're so close, it doesn't matter. But they're going to get this big win against Utah, and then kind of like they almost got a big win against Alabama last year, 31-29, almost pulled it out. And then they're going to go on to play a brutal schedule that includes A&M, that includes LSU, that includes Georgia. Tennessee, I think, is a brutal, terrible matchup for Florida, the way Tennessee plays offense. By the way, if any team in the regular season beats Georgia this year, it's going to be Tennessee. It's not going to be Florida. So I think that Florida's going to still drop 3 or 4 games. People are going to forget about them. They're a solid team with a hard record. It's given me 2019 Texas A&M vibes, where A&M could not get ranked. They finished the season, I think, 8-4. They could not get ranked, but they played like 4 teams that were at one point number 1 through the year. Multiple close games, especially that crazy Clemson game. Maybe that was 2018. But anyway, that's what I think we're going to get with Florida. So people might be a little too high on them because we want Florida to be good. I think they're going to be too high on them. Okay, now I've talked long enough that you can give me yours.
Yeah, I think there's going to be an overreaction with Arkansas, actually, because a lot of people are going to say they won a hard-fought game with a great Cincinnati team, and they were already 19, so they're going to move up in the polls because they had a ranked win. I think a lot of people in the chat have talked about USC. I think Rice has been a team that's gotten just steamrolled by mediocre teams a number of times in recent years, so there's an argument for that. I think Notre Dame is probably going to stay highly ranked because of their competitive game for far longer than possible. So there's a lot of answers to it. I think Arkansas is maybe the most likely, and it'll be the most irritating because I think people will just say, hey, look, Arkansas, tough win, and it's a big deal to grit out a win against a ranked team, and so they'll automatically move them up. And I'm not really sure that's fair or realistic.
Arkansas is a good one. You know, we talked about Arkansas earlier tonight. I didn't love what I saw from KJ Jefferson. I didn't love in general. I needed Arkansas to win that game by 13 to 17 points, especially the way Cincinnati played. I didn't see that, so I agree with it. All right, y'all, we're going to do some previews this week. We're going to probably cut up our top 10 and get it out there, maybe cut up some of our commentary on the playoffs. We are going to try to do some sort of collaboration with Josh Pate. I think it might be on the playoff expansion because we all just want to sit around and have a roundtable about how much we hate it. But thanks so much, y'all, for hanging out on the live stream for 2 hours and 14 minutes. If you want to listen to this, maybe you got on late, we'll put it out on podcast version as well. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.